The city never slept, not in the traditional sense. Its nights were not quiet or dark, but alive with an unsettling presence, relentless symphony of electrical storms, and an omnipresent static that seeped into every corner, every crack of the sprawling urban maze. I, Elias Vorn, had become intimately familiar with this pervasive hum. It was the soundtrack of my existence, a constant companion and at times a maddening adversary. My studio, a cramped room perched above the lower districts, was cluttered with outdated equipment salvaged from forgotten tech bazaars and personal projects gone awry. Wires snaked across every surface, old monitors flickered with erratic life, and speakers hissed softly as they emitted the ever-present static that blanketed the city. Tonight was no different on the surface. The storms raged outside with their usual fury lightning, splintering the sky in jagged veins of white light, thunder rolling like distant godly drums. Rain battered the grimy windows, blurring the neon glow of advertisements and the outlines of endless antennae that pierced the skyline like metallic trees. Inside, I sat hunched over my console, headphones snug against my ears, eyes scanning the oscilloscopes and frequency analyzers. The city's interference was a complicated mess, a maddening jigsaw of signals and noise that I had spent years learning to navigate. Routine signal tests, as mundane as they were, offered a temporary reprieve from the monotony of the storms. I adjusted the dials, seeking clear channels amidst the chaos. The static was thick tonight, thicker than usual, almost suffocating in its density. Yet, beneath the familiar crackle, something else stirred, a faint anomaly, a whisper beneath the storm's roar. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch, a momentary quirk in the circuitry. But the subtle pattern persisted, a fragile thread woven through the noise. I leaned closer, heart quickening. The monitors flickered erratically, the green waveforms dancing with strange irregularity. Through the static, I caught the barest hint of voices, indistinct, distant, yet unmistakably human. They were fragmented, broken by interference, but there was a rhythm, an emotional cadence that drew me in. Desperation, sorrow, a trembling plea buried beneath layers of distortion. My fingers trembled as I adjusted the frequency, coaxing the signal into focus. The voices ebbed and flowed like a ghostly tide, elusive and tantalizing. I recorded the transmissions, replaying them in a loop, trying to decipher the hidden messages. The city's relentless storm outside seemed to pulse in tandem with the mysterious broadcast, as if the very weather itself was a vessel for these spectral voices. Doubt gnawed at the edges of my mind. Was this some elaborate prank? A hallucination born of sleepless nights and overexposure to electromagnetic radiation? Yet the technical precision of the signal argued otherwise. This was no random interference. It was deliberate, and it was begging to be heard. I settled back, rubbing my eyes. The studio felt colder, the shadows deeper. In this city, where every corner was veiled by static and storm, the discovery felt like a crack in the fabric of reality itself. What lay beyond the veil? What realm had these voices come from? And why were they trapped beneath the endless hum? The questions were relentless, and already I knew I would not rest until I found answers. The static had always been noise to me, background interference to be filtered out. But now it was a veil, a haunting curtain that concealed truths too unsettling to ignore. I glanced at the clock. Dawn was still hours away, but the city's storm showed no signs of abating. Somewhere in the unending roar, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. And I, a simple sound engineer caught in the eye of the storm, was about to plunge headfirst into the unknown. The first crackle of the anomalous frequency had broken the silence, and there was no turning back now. Outside, the relentless storm continued its ceaseless dance. Somewhere beyond the flickering neon and rain-slick streets, hidden beneath the layers of static and interference, the voices waited. And I was listening. The relentless hum of static was a constant companion in my cluttered studio, a persistent drone that blurred the edges of reality and noise. As I leaned closer to the tangle of wires and dials before me, my fingers danced over the controls with practiced precision, coaxing out the faintest threads of sound hidden beneath the city's omnipresent electrical storms. Tonight, however, the static was different, laden with faint, indecipherable voices that whispered just below the threshold of comprehension. I pressed the headphones tighter against my ears, heart thudding in sync with the pulsing interference. The voices were fragmented, like shards of a shattered mirror reflecting a scene I could not yet see whole. There were desperate pleas, stifled cries for help, and cryptic references to being trapped words that felt less like random data and more like a message from a place beyond our own. My breath caught as a tremor of recognition passed through me. This was no ordinary interference. Something was reaching out through the static, and I was the only one who could hear. For hours I pored over the recordings, isolating phrases, piecing together emotional undercurrents hidden in the distortion. The voices trembled with fear and longing, painting a portrait of silent suffering that clawed at the edges of my mind. Yet, with each breakthrough, a creeping unease settled in. The more I uncovered, the more I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching my every move. I knew I needed someone else to bear this burden, someone who could help me navigate the uncertain and dangerous path ahead. Mara Lynn was the only person I trusted enough to share these disturbing discoveries. I found her in a dim, cramped cafe nestled in the heart of the city's battered core. Neon signs flickered outside, casting sharp, fractured shadows across her sharp features as she listened. Headphones wrapped around her head, eyes narrowed in concentration. "It sounds like a cry for help," I said, voice low and urgent. But from where or when? Mara's skepticism was palpable, her brow furrowing as she processed the strange sounds. "Elias, it could be anything. Interference, hallucination, even a prank. You've been pushing yourself too hard." I met her gaze, desperation threading my words. "I know what I'm hearing. These aren't random signals. There's something trapped out there, and it's calling to us." Her eyes softened, and after a long pause, she nodded. "All right, I'll help you monitor the signals. But we do this cautiously. No reckless moves." Back in my studio, the atmosphere thickened with tension. The equipment, usually my sanctuary, began to betray signs of interference. Dials spun erratically, screens flickered with static bursts, and cables vibrated with an unnatural hum. I wasn't alone in this pursuit. Something or someone was trying to stop me. The city's oppressive static wasn't just background noise. It was a barrier, a veil maintained by forces intent on keeping these voices silent. The nights grew darker, the storms more violent, yet I found myself drawn deeper into the maddening puzzle. I wandered the rain-slicked streets, earbuds feeding me the fractured pleas, the city's neon glow smeared by wet asphalt reflecting the turmoil within me. Isolation wrapped around me like a shroud, but beneath it flickered a desperate hope that through this static, a bridge might be built between worlds. Each whisper, each broken phrase, was a thread pulling me toward a truth too unsettling to ignore. But as I delved further, the line between reality and hallucination blurred, and the shadows lengthened. The question that haunted me most wasn't just what the voices were, but what price I was willing to pay to answer their call. The air in the studio was thick with static, a pervasive hum that seemed to seep into the walls themselves, saturating every inch of the cramped space where Elias Vaughan worked tirelessly. His fingers danced over the broken console, adjusting dials and filters, chasing the ethereal threads of a frequency that defied logic. The voices came and went like ghosts caught in a storm, fragments of sound that slipped through the white noise, sometimes clear, sometimes maddeningly distorted. He pressed the headphones closer, willing himself to catch every syllable. every subtle inflection buried beneath the crackling interference. Help. Trapped. Don't leave us. The words were faint, fractured, yet unmistakably human. Elias's heart thudded against his ribs, a mix of excitement and unease twisting in his gut. The city outside was a tempest of flickering neon and relentless thunder, the electrical storms that had become a permanent fixture in the skyline, casting erratic shadows through the studio's grimy windows. Each lightning strike seemed to pulse through the very frequency he chased, as if the storm itself was a key to unlocking the secrets hidden in the static. Sleep had become a distant memory. Elias found himself submerged in the broadcasts, his waking hours consumed by the relentless urge to decode the messages from beyond. But the deeper he tuned, the more the line between signal and hallucination blurred. Faces appeared at the edge of his vision. Whispers echoed in empty rooms. The static no longer felt like mere noise. It was alive, a living shroud that wrapped around his mind. It was on one such night, when the storm outside reached a crescendo, that Elias heard a knock at his door. The unexpected visitor was a thin, pale man, his presence unsettling yet oddly familiar. Dr. Kalen Sato, he introduced himself, voice calm but edged with urgency. You've been following your work. The anomalies you're detecting, they're not just random interference. Sato's eyes, sharp behind round glasses, flicked to the monitors where swirling electromagnetic patterns danced like restless spirits. These signals originate from liminal spaces zones where dimensions brush against each other, made unstable by the city's storms. You're venturing into dangerous territory, Elias. The more you probe, the greater the risk to your mind and your reality. Despite the warning, Elias felt a flicker of hope. Here was someone who understood the enigma, someone who could help him navigate the fractured frequencies. They spent hours poring over data, Sato explaining the theoretical underpinnings of electromagnetic overlaps and the city's unique storm dynamics that might create a doorway between worlds. Yet, as the nights wore on, the broadcasts grew more vivid, their emotional weight pressing down on Elias like a physical force. The voices were no longer just sounds. They became memories, pleas etched into his consciousness. He found himself pacing his tiny apartment, mumbling fragments of the transmissions, unable to resist their pull. In moments of clarity, Elias questioned his own sanity. Was this a descent into madness fueled by isolation and obsession, or was he truly on the verge of a breakthrough that could shatter the boundaries of known reality? Sato's presence was both a balm and a reminder of the precariousness of Elias's journey. The scientist's clinical detachment was tempered by hints of his own haunted past, and his ambiguous motives cast shadows over their alliance. The chapter closes as Elias sits alone, the storm raging outside, the static alive in his ears, and the fractured frequencies beckoning him deeper into the unknown. The boundary between worlds is thinning, and so too is the line between Elias's mind and the spectral broadcasts. The question now is not whether he will uncover the truth, but whether he will survive the cost. If I lose myself, Elias whispered into the static, maybe I can save them. And with that, the hum of the city's endless storm swallowed his words, carrying them into the fractured night. The electric hum of the city's unending storm infiltrated every corner of my small studio, a persistent static that had become as familiar as the beat of my own heart. Tonight, though, the usual background drone felt different, thicker, heavier, as if the storm itself had eyes. I sat hunched over the console, fingers twitching around dials and sliders, eyes scanning waveforms on the cracked monitor. The faint whispers, those fractured voices from the hidden frequency, had grown clearer in certain bursts, but my attention was drawn elsewhere. A flicker on the feed from the street camera outside caught the corner of my eye. There, just beyond the rain-slicked glass, a shadow lingered. The figure was indistinct, but the posture was deliberate, unblinking. I froze, pulse quickening, The storm static buzzed louder in my ears. Every crackle seemed to echo a warning. "They're watching," I muttered to myself, the words tasting bitter. It wasn't paranoia. It was proof. The silent authority wasn't just a rumor anymore. It was real, and it was closing in. The doorbell's chime shattered the tense silence. Mara. She slipped inside, her sharp eyes immediately assessing the room, the monitors, my tense posture. "I saw him too," she whispered, voice low but urgent. "Crow. He's been tailing you for days. We need a plan. Crow." The name felt like ice on my skin. Officially, he didn't exist, but his presence was undeniable. A ghost in the city's surveillance network, a cold shadow moving through the static. His methods were subtle but ruthless. Signal jammers, psychological pressure, the occasional unmarked van, parked too long outside my studio. We moved quickly, scanning blueprints of the city, plotting routes and safe houses. Mara's experience as a tech journalist proved invaluable. She knew the underground networks, the blind spots in the city's all-seeing eye. We rigged makeshift jammers, layered our communications with encryption, and started using coded messages woven into my recordings. Yet, every step forward felt like treading deeper into a labyrinth. My studio, once a sanctuary of sound and clarity, now felt like a cage humming with unseen threats. The storm outside intensified, lightning flashing through the grimy windows, casting erratic shadows. I could feel the boundary between reality and the distorted broadcasts blurring, the voices from the hidden frequency whispering warnings of their own. One night, as the city plunged into a sudden blackout, an orchestrated move by the silent authority to disrupt my equipment, found myself darting through rain-slick alleys, heart hammering against ribs, the hum of drones slicing the air above. The oppressive atmosphere was suffocating, but surrender was not an option. I was the conduit, the only link between worlds. Back at the studio, Mara's hand steadied mine as we adjusted the jammers, our breaths shallow but resolute. "We can't let them silence us," she said, eyes fierce in the flickering glow of monitors. I nodded, the weight of the storm surveillance pressing down, but also a stubborn ember of hope kindling within. The silent authority wanted control, censorship, the erasure of what they feared. But I was determined to resist, to peel back the static veil, and listen to the voices trapped beyond, even if it meant walking blind into the storm's heart. The nights grew longer, the threats closer, but with Mara by my side and the static as my guide, I edged further into the unknown. The hunt for truth had become a battle for survival, and the city's relentless storm was both adversary and ally in this fight. As the chapter closes, the flicker of static on the monitors resolves into a faint, unmistakable pulse, a call from beyond, urging me onward despite the tightening noose. The storm rages on, but so does my resolve. The studio was cloaked in shadows, punctuated only by the intermittent flicker of neon bleeding through the grimy windows. Elias sat hunched over his console, fingers deftly adjusting dials and sliders, his eyes narrowed behind tired lids. The hum of the city's electrical storms was a constant companion, a low, omnipresent static that seemed less like background noise and more like an oppressive shroud suffocating the city and him. Tonight, the usual patterns of interference were disrupted. A faint whisper emerged from the tangled frequencies, a spectral voice riding the waves of static, fragile, and broken. Alias's heart quickened as he isolated the signal, the voice fragmenting into cryptic syllables that seemed eerily familiar. He replayed the recording, slowing the tempo, filtering out the noise, desperate to catch a coherent phrase. Nightfall, 12th of March, East Sector. Help. The date struck him like a physical blow. It was the night his younger sibling, Leon, had vanished without a trace during one of the city's earliest storms. The memory was a jagged scar in his psyche, a wound reopened anew. Elias's breath hitched as a surge of emotion flooded him. Grief, anger, hope, all tangled into a desperate need for answers. He leaned back, rubbing his temples, the runes spinning slightly. The voices from the hidden broadcasts were no longer distant echoes. They were threads weaving directly into the fabric of his own fractured past. Was it coincidence, or had the static been whispering truths he had long buried? A knock at the door broke his reverie. Mara stepped inside, her sharp gaze immediately assessing the disarray. "Elias, you've been at this all night," she said, voice edged with concern. "You're chasing ghosts again." He gestured to the screen, replaying the faint voice. "Listen to this. It mentions Leon's disappearance. This isn't just some random signal. It's connected." Mara's frown deepened as she sifted through his scattered notes and recordings. "If this is true, it changes everything. But you have to be careful. You're getting lost in this, Elias." He looked up, eyes burning with a mix of desperation and resolve. "I can't turn back now. This could be the key to understanding the storms and what happened to Leon." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden burst of static that crackled through the speakers, a sharp, chilling plea cutting through the noise. "Help us. Trapped. Please." Elias flinched, the sound reverberating through his chest. The voices weren't just signals. They were cries from a realm imprisoned by the city's electrical storms, echoes of suffering that mirrored his own pain. As the storm outside intensified, lightning casting fleeting shadows across the room, Elias stood by the window, gazing out at the neon-lit streets. The city was alive with buzzing wires and electric pulses, but beneath it all lay a silent anguish that he was only beginning to comprehend. He whispered to himself, "I'll find you, Leon, and I'll find them all." The path ahead was shrouded in static and uncertainty, but Elias's resolve was unwavering. The past was no longer just a memory. It was a beacon guiding him deeper into the heart of the storm. The night stretched on, the voices growing louder, the mystery pulling him ever closer to the edge of revelation and madness. As dawn threatened the horizon, Elias's fingers hovered over the controls, ready to dive further into the unknown. Somewhere beyond the veil, answers awaited, and he was determined to reach them, no matter the cost. The static hummed on, an eerie lullaby that promised both salvation and ruin. And the city listened, silent but watching. The static never truly paused in the city, a relentless, omnipresent hum that had become the soundtrack of my existence. But tonight, beneath the usual drone, there was something different. A subtle shift, a tremor in the white noise that prickled my skin and tugged at the edges of my sanity. I sat hunched in my cramped studio, the walls cluttered with tangled cables, battered speakers, and oscilloscopes flickering with indecipherable graphs. Rain tapped rhythmically against the grimy window, and beyond, the city writhed under another furious electrical storm. The air was thick with ozone and charged ions, but inside, the real storm was brewing in the speakers. As I adjusted the tuner, static warped, folding in on itself like a living thing. Then came the voices, faint, fractured, ethereal. Not the usual garbled bursts or mechanical crackle, but something altogether more unsettling. They whispered just beneath the threshold of comprehension, like a half-remembered dream or a secret whispered in the dark. I leaned in, breath caught, heart racing. "Help. Trapped. Can you hear us?" The words slipped through the static, fragile and desperate. I rewound the recording again and again, isolating the strands of sound, trying to piece together meaning from the chaos. But the voices twisted and fragmented, sometimes merging with bursts of static, sometimes dissolving into silence. It was as if the signal itself was haunted, carrying imprints of pain and loss, echoes of something beyond the physical world. The more I listened, the more the boundaries between reality and hallucination blurred. The studio lights flickered, shadows danced on the walls, and the static seemed to pulse with a sinister rhythm, almost alive. At times, I swore I could see shapes flickering in the periphery, glimmers of movement where none should be. My skin prickled as if touched by unseen fingers, and the hum in my ears grew louder, a relentless drone pressing in on my mind. I was losing my grip. Mara came to see me the next day, her sharp eyes scanning the chaotic tangle of equipment and notes sprawled across my desk. "Elias," she said gently, but with steel beneath her concern, "this obsession, it's eating you. You're not the only one hearing things. You're seeing things too." I bristled at her words. She didn't understand. This wasn't madness. It was revelation. "The static," I said, voice low and intense, "it's more than noise. It's alive. It's a veil, a membrane between worlds. I'm hearing their pleas. They're trapped, Mara." She shook her head, frustration and worry etched into her features. "Or maybe you're chasing ghosts in your mind. You need to hold on, Elias, before this thing drags you under." Her words stung, but I couldn't pull away. The recordings beckoned me back, each playback revealing new layers of ghostly imprints, faint harmonics beneath the static, like the fingerprints of trapped souls. I ran spectral analyses, adjusted filters, and tweaked my equipment to reveal what had been hidden. One night, as the city convulsed under the storm's electric wrath, I sat alone, headphones wrapped tight around my ears. The voices surged up, clearer than ever, overlapping in a cacophony of sorrow and urgency. I closed my eyes, letting the sound wash over me, feeling their pain seep into my bones. "We are lost. We need you. Please." The room dimmed, and the static thickened, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. Shadows stretched and writhed in the corners of my vision. I fought to stay anchored, to remember who I was. This was no longer just a signal. It was a haunting, a siren call from beyond the veil. And I was answering. The low hum of fluorescent lights, coupled with the distant growl of the ever-present storm, was the soundtrack to Dr. Kalen Sato's cramped laboratory. Elias Vaughan stepped cautiously over a maze of cables and scattered equipment, his eyes scanning the tangled mess with a mixture of awe and unease. The air smelled faintly of ozone and solder, an electric anticipation hanging heavy in the room. "Here," Sato said, motioning to a bank of electromagnetic sensors, perched precariously on the edge of a cluttered workbench. His thin fingers adjusted a dial, eliciting a soft whine that vibrated through the metal chassis. These devices, when synchronized with the storm's electromagnetic pulses, can detect fluctuations not just in our physical environment, but in the spaces between. Elias's brow furrowed. Spaces between? Sato's pale eyes glinted behind round glasses. Liminal spaces. Zones where realities overlap, created and sustained by the chaotic energy of these electrical storms. Your hidden frequency, the one you've been chasing, it's not just noise. It's a signal emanating from one of these thresholds. The revelation settled over Elias like a shockwave. He had suspected there was something more to the voices buried beneath the static, but to hear it framed in scientific terms gave a new weight to his obsession. "Show me," Elias urged. Over the next several hours, the two men bent over oscilloscopes and frequency analyzers, piecing together a tentative map of the city's electromagnetic topology. Sato explained how the storms acted as both veil and gateway, their erratic pulses sculpting invisible corridors between dimensions. Elias absorbed every word, his mind racing to envision how he might push his equipment beyond its usual parameters. Back in his studio, a cramped sanctuary cluttered with audio gear and walls plastered with spectral charts and waveform printouts, he began the painstaking process of modification. He replaced standard receivers with custom-built amplifiers capable of filtering out the overwhelming static. He integrated phase shift modulators and feedback loops to coax the liminal signals into sharper focus. Night after night, The city's neon glow flickered through rain-speckled windows as Elias immersed himself in the distorted symphony. The deeper he tuned, the more the voices emerged, snatches of desperate pleas, fragmented memories, and mournful whispers that seemed to seep from a place both alien and achingly familiar. Yet with every breakthrough came a creeping unease. The boundary between signal and mind began to blur. The static seemed to pulse with a life of its own, invading his senses even when the equipment was off. Mara Lynn's visits became more frequent and urgent. Her sharp eyes scanned the chaos of cables and screens, and her tone was firm, yet gentle. "Elias, you're chasing shadows in a storm that's already swallowing you whole," she warned one evening, her voice cutting through the hum of machines. "You can't lose yourself over voices that might just be echoes of your own mind." He looked up, exhaustion lining his face. "But what if they're real, Mara? What if this is the only chance to reach them?" She sighed, placing a steady hand on his arm. "Then we find a way to do it without losing you." Despite her caution, Elias knew he was teetering on the edge. The recordings showed new layers of complexity, patterns within patterns, bursts of clarity amidst the chaos. Dr. Sato's theories gave him hope that the liminal space could be navigated, even controlled. But with every attempt, the storm outside seemed to grow fiercer, as if the city itself resisted his intrusion. Static crackled louder in his headphones, sometimes erupting into spectral voices that whispered directly to him, blurring the line between the trapped realm and his own fragile psyche. One night, as lightning fractured the sky, Elias sat bathed in the blue glow of his monitors. The modified receiver thrummed in his hands, tuned precisely to the frequencies Sato had identified. The static exploded into a chorus of voices, some pleading, others warning, all laden with raw emotion. He closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him, feeling the pull of a threshold just beyond reach. Suddenly, a sharp crack jolted him back. The equipment flickered, screens flashing erratically. For a heartbeat, the storm outside and the storm within him converged. Elias's fingers trembled over the controls, desperate to hold the fragile connection. A whispered echo floated through the headphones, crossed the threshold, his breath caught. The choice lay before him, to push deeper into the unknown or retreat to safety. The city's electrical storm raged on, an unyielding symphony of chaos and possibility. And Elias Vorn, caught between worlds, prepared to cross the boundaries that had long defined his existence. But as the hum of static swelled around him, a question lingered. Was what awaited beyond the threshold salvation or oblivion? The night stretched on, thick with electricity and unspoken promises. As Elias calibrated his device for the next plunge into the liminal depths, unaware that with each step he took, the silent authority's shadowed gaze drew ever nearer. The thunder rumbled low and relentless outside the grimy windows of my studio, a ceaseless drumbeat beneath the city's electrical storms. The static had grown from a subtle hiss to an overwhelming roar, drowning out the familiar hum of my equipment. Flickering screens cast pale blue light over a mess of wires and tangled cables. It felt like the air itself was charged, heavy with something unseen, something hostile. It started with a subtle shift in the interference patterns, a jagged pulse that sliced through the usual white noise. The signal jammers had found me. Their presence was no longer a distant threat, but a physical assault on every frequency I touched. Each attempt to tune in to the hidden broadcast was met with a harsh, grating distortion that clawed at my sanity. I watched the needles on my monitors twitch erratically, the signals twisting and snapping like a living thing fighting to be heard. The voices, the fragile, desperate whispers I had come to know, were being drowned beneath an ocean of mechanical shrieks and static crashes. It was as if the city itself, or whatever force bent to suppress the truth, was squeezing the air from my lungs. A sudden sharp knock shattered the tense silence. My heart leapt into my throat. The door rattled under repeated pounding. Outside, muffled voices exchanged clipped commands, accompanied by the unmistakable whir of surveillance drones hovering just beyond the cracked glass. The silent authority had arrived. I scrambled to shut down my equipment, desperate to erase any trace of my work from their prying eyes and ears. The room seemed to close in on me, the shadows deepening as the storm's fury battered the city streets. I could hear the agent's footsteps, cautious but unyielding, moving closer. "Elias!" Mara's voice sliced through the chaos as she appeared at the back exit, breath coming in sharp bursts. "Get out! They're coming for you." I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my portable recorder and a few essential tools, I slipped through the cramped exit, the cold rain immediately soaking into my clothes. The city's neon glow was distorted by the sheets of rain, the usual cacophony of hums and buzzes replaced by a suffocating silence punctuated only by distant thunder. Mara caught up with me in a narrow alley, her sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "We need to move fast," she said, her voice steady despite the storm. "They're already jamming signals across the district." I nodded, the weight of the moment settling heavily on my shoulders. Every step away from my studio felt like leaving a part of myself behind. My sanctuary, my battleground, my prison. "They won't stop," I said, voice hoarse. "They want to erase everything." Mara's gaze hardened. "Then we'll have to be smarter. We find new ways. The static isn't just noise, it's the veil they fear. We can use it against them." Her determination was a lifeline, a flicker of light in the storm's endless night. Yet beneath it all, I could feel the creeping tendrils of paranoia wrapping tighter around my mind. The line between reality and hallucination blurred like the rain-slicked streets beneath our feet. As we vanished into the city's shadows, the oppressive static buzzed in my ears, a reminder that the fight was far from over. The silent authority had struck hard, but their grip was not absolute. Somewhere beyond the storm, the voices waited, and I would find a way to hear them again. But the question that haunted every step was clear: how long before the storm swallowed us all? The rain hammered down relentlessly, each drop a tiny drumbeat in a symphony of chaos. Above, lightning cracked the sky open, illuminating the city in jagged, fleeting bursts. In the distance, sirens wailed a dissonant chorus to the unfolding battle for truth and connection. I clenched the recorder tighter, its cold metal a fragile talisman against the encroaching silence. Mara's figure moved ahead with purpose, a beacon of defiance in the neon-soaked night. Together, we melted into the labyrinth of alleys and forgotten passageways, hunted yet unbroken. The static might have been their weapon, but it was also our message, a signal of resistance flickering stubbornly through the storm. And I was listening. The flickering glow of the monitors cast elongated shadows across the cramped corners of my studio, where the hum of static now felt less like background noise and more like a living presence. The voices at once fragile and insistent pierced through the white noise in splintered fragments. They were not words I could fully grasp, yet their emotional resonance was unmistakable. Desperation, longing, silent cries for salvation. Each night blurred into the next as sleep became a tenuous refuge. When I did drift into dreams, the city transformed into a fractured tableau of shimmering lights and pulsing storms. Ghostly silhouettes emerged from behind veils of static, their ethereal forms reaching toward me with mute sorrow. I woke gasping, the spectral impressions lingering in the hollowed spaces of my mind. Mara found me pacing the dim hallway outside my apartment one evening, my eyes wild, hands trembling as I replayed the latest recordings. "Elias," she said firmly, her sharp gaze cutting through the haze of my obsession. "You need to ground yourself. These voices, they're breaking through your mind, not just your equipment." Her words were a tether, but the pull of the broadcasts was relentless. I confided in Dr. Kalen Sato, whose pale frame hunched over his consoles amid a labyrinth of wires and screens. His voice was clinical, yet tinged with unease, as he explained the electromagnetic anomalies we were chasing. These liminal spaces, he said, are as much a trap for the mind as they are for the signals. You must guard your sanity as fiercely as your equipment. Despite the warnings, I plunged deeper. The broadcasts now carried stories, fragmented narratives of entrapment and silent suffering from a realm, parallel yet hauntingly close. The signals seeped into my waking hours, twisting perception, making shadows dance with unseen faces. The city's oppressive static was no longer mere noise. It was a veil hiding a tortured truth. As the boundary between what I heard and what I believed thinned, I wrestled with my own mind. Was I losing grip on reality, or was reality itself bending under the storm's influence? Mara's steady presence anchored me, even as my paranoia grew. Dr. Sato's scientific detachment offered frameworks but no comfort. Each distorted transmission was a shard of a greater puzzle, beckoning me toward a truth that terrified and compelled me in equal measure. The voices were more than echoes. They were reaching out, yearning for rescue from a prison woven of storms and static, a prison I was now determined to breach. But with every step forward, the shadows lengthened. The silent authorities' interference intensified, their cold, mechanical presence a reminder that some truths were meant to remain buried. As I navigated the labyrinth of signals and sanity, I realized that the greatest battle was not just to save the lost voices, but to preserve the fragile thread of my own mind. The static whispered on, carrying secrets I could no longer ignore, pulling me toward a precipice where the fragments of reality might shatter completely or coalesce into something new. I stood at the edge, listening, waiting for the next transmission, the next plea, the next glimpse into the unknown. And I knew, deep down, that turning back was no longer an option. The storm outside roared in celebration or warning, I could not tell which. But the voices were waiting, and I had to answer. The rain had just begun to taper off when I slipped through the narrow side alley. The familiar crackle of static in the air, mingling with the distant rumble of thunder still rolling across the city skyline. Neon signs flickered erratically above the puddle-speckled pavement, casting fractured glows that danced with the shadows clinging to the walls. I was late. Mara had warned me to be cautious, but curiosity gnawed at my thoughts, an itch I couldn't scratch until I met the man who knew the city's undercurrents better than anyone jocks. The alley was a maze of forgotten passages, and I found him leaning against a rusted fire escape ladder, his leather jacket soaked and clinging to his wiry frame. A cap pulled low obscured most of his face, but his eyes were sharp, darting, always measuring. "You, Elias?" Jox's voice was low, edged with suspicion. "I've been expecting you." "Yeah," I answered, trying to steady my breath. "You said you had information about the tech they're using, the silent authorities' gear." He nodded slowly, glancing over his shoulder before pulling me deeper into the maze of backstreets. "They've got their fingers everywhere. Signal jammers, drones, surveillance rigs, buried in the walls and sky. Not just to watch, but to silence." We ducked beneath a flickering neon sign advertising a long-closed bar, the electric hum blending with the ever-present static that seemed to pulse beneath the city's skin. Mara joined us a few steps behind, her sharp eyes scanning every shadow. "This place," Jox whispered, "is just the tip. The authorities' grip runs deep, hiding in places most people don't dare to look." Our path led us to the city's subterranean network, tangled web of tunnels and forgotten service corridors, where the city's heartbeat slowed and the noise faded to a low throb. The air was thick with the scent of damp concrete and ozone, and the distant drip of water echoed like a metronome for our hurried steps. Mara's practical urban wear blended with the dim surroundings as she pulled out a small flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. "Stay close," she murmured. At one point, we passed a cluster of graffiti cryptic symbols overlaid with hastily scrawled warnings. It was a clandestine language of rebellion and fear, the city's silent screams etched in paint. Jocks led us to a hidden alcove where a dusty workbench sprawled beneath a flickering overhead bulb. On it lay an array of devices, signal jammers, transmitters, and surveillance equipment, abandoned but still ominously alive with faint blinking lights. I ran a trembling hand over a device shaped like a small box with antennae protruding like spindly legs. The sheer scale of the silent authorities' technological reach chilled me. This was more than surveillance. This was control, censorship, a chokehold on any possibility of connection beyond the static. They want to keep the voices buried, Jock said grimly. Anything that threatens their order gets snuffed out. Mara's gaze met mine, a silent understanding passing between us. We weren't just chasing whispers anymore. We were tangling with a force that would stop at nothing. Back out in the wet streets, the city seemed to pulse with renewed menace. I clutched the crude map Jocks had sketched, a chaotic web of safe houses, dead zones, and the locations of known authority installations. The static in the air seemed louder here, a living presence pressing in from every direction. This is just the beginning, Mara said, her voice steady despite the tension. We need to prepare. I nodded, the weight of what lay ahead settling deep in my chest. Somewhere beneath the electrical storms and the unending hum of static, the truth waited hidden, fragile, and dangerous. As we parted ways that night, the city's shadows grew longer. The storm clouds thickened, and the line between safety and peril blurred like the signals I chased. I knew that every step we took into the underworld of this city brought us closer to the heart of the mystery and to the watchful eyes of the silent authority. But I had to keep going, because the voices weren't just noise. They were cries for rescue, and I was the only one listening. The next days were a blur of whispered meetings and cautious exploration. Jocks became an indispensable guide, leading me and Mara through forgotten passages and hidden alcoves where the city's pulse beat beneath the surface. Each step revealed layers of a secret infrastructure designed to suppress and manipulate. One evening, as the city's neon glow flickered through rain-streaked windows, Mara and I examined the devices Jocks had procured. We found tampered receivers, hacked transmitters, and signal scramblers designed to jam frequencies like the ones I detected. The sophistication was staggering. This wasn't a ragtag operation, but a well-funded, deeply embedded system. They've been at this for years, Mara said, her fingers tracing the circuitry on a jammer, suppressing everything that threatens their narrative. I felt the familiar itch behind my eyes, the relentless urge to decode, to break through the veil. But the threat was no longer abstract. The silent authority's presence was a living shadow, stalking every corner of the city and our very minds. Our nights grew longer and more perilous. Surveillance drones buzzed overhead, their mechanical eyes probing for any sign of dissent. Agent Crow's shadow loomed closer, a constant reminder that our rebellion was as much psychological as it was physical. Yet, amidst the danger, the voices from the hidden frequency grew clearer, their pleas more desperate. They beckoned me deeper into the labyrinth of static and shadows, a siren call I could no longer resist. The city's underbelly had revealed its secrets, but the true battle was only beginning. Between the flickering neon lights and the ever-present hum of electrical storms, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone. And whatever lay ahead, I had to face it, for the voices depended on it. As the rain began once more to fall softly over the cracked pavement, I readied myself to plunge further into the urban shadows, into the heart of the storm, where reality fractured and salvation waited just beyond the static. The streets were a tangle of wet reflections and muted sounds, each step echoing with the weight of what I'd learned. Mara's voice cut through the haze as we planned our next move, the city's oppressive atmosphere pressing close. "We need to find the nexus," she said, eyes sharp and unwavering. "Where the signals converge, where the boundary thins." I nodded, the lines between hope and fear blurring like the static that haunted my every thought. The silent authority was watching, waiting. But so was the truth, waiting to be uncovered beneath the urban shadows. And I was listening. The low hum of static filled my cramped studio, a constant companion since the city had succumbed to the unending electrical storms. The monitors flickered with waveforms, spectral fragments of a frequency I had been chasing relentlessly. Hours blurred into one another, the outside world dissolving beneath layers of static and data. Tonight, something was different. As the storm rumbled in the distance, a pattern emerged from the chaos, a rhythm pulsing in sync with the thunder, a heartbeat buried beneath the noise. I leaned closer, eyes scanning the cascade of numbers and audio waves. The broadcasts I had collected over weeks, each fragment a whisper from that other place, now aligned like pieces of a puzzle. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a fragile signal threading through the storm's fury. My fingers trembled as I adjusted the filters, isolating the frequency that had haunted my nights. It pulsed steadily, a haunting thrum that seemed to echo the city's heartbeat. The studio's dim light cast long shadows, the clutter of cables and equipment around me feeling like a tangled web I was ensnared in. Outside, lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged skyline. The city was a living organism, its storms both prison and key. Somewhere within that tempest was the liminal zone, the doorway between worlds. I had only glimpsed through fractured signals. My thoughts drifted briefly to Mara. She had been my anchor, my voice of reason amid the growing chaos in my mind. But lately, her visits had become strained, her sharp eyes shadowed with worry. Our last conversation replayed in my mind, her words sharp but caring. "Elias, you're slipping away," she had said, frustration and fear tangled in her voice. "This obsession, it's consuming you." "I have to know, Mara," I had replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "If I don't, those voices will be lost forever." She shook her head, the weight of our growing distance crushing. I hated that my quest isolated me, but the pull of the unknown was too strong. Back at the monitors, I mapped the frequencies against the storm's cycles. The liminal zone wasn't just a theory. It was real, a fragile seam where reality thinned and the echoes of that trapped realm bled through. Each pulse of the frequency was a breath, a signal from beyond our world, begging for connection. The realization was electric, a mixture of awe and dread. What lay beyond the veil? Was it salvation or damnation? The deeper I tuned, the more the city seemed to warp around me. Static patterns shifted like living things, whispering secrets I could barely comprehend. Exhaustion tugged at my limbs, but sleep was a stranger. Instead, I climbed to the rooftop under the rain's cold kiss, the city sprawling beneath me like a circuit board alive with energy. Storms crackled, casting surreal light over the wet asphalt and glass towers. The liminal space was out there, somewhere in the heart of this storm-ravaged city, and I was its reluctant herald. I pressed my palm to the cold metal railing, grounding myself against the storm's fury and my own spiraling thoughts. The path ahead was dangerous, uncertain, but I couldn't turn back now. The voices depended on me. As lightning arced across the sky, illuminating the darkness, I whispered a silent vow to cross the threshold, to confront the unknown, and to bring the trapped souls back from the edge of silence. But at what cost? The city's static whispered answers I wasn't ready to hear. And in that moment, the line between reality and the broadcast blurred irrevocably, pulling me deeper into the storm's secret. I wasn't just chasing signals anymore. I was chasing a lifeline, and the storm was listening. The city was a tempest tonight, a living beast of crackling energy and relentless rain. Elias Vorn adjusted the collar of his worn coat, the fabric soaked through, but no shield against the electric ferocity that raged overhead. Lightning tore the sky in jagged blue veins, illuminating the streets in stark, fleeting flashes. The static was louder here, as if the storm itself were a desperate broadcast, a scream trapped in electromagnetic waves swirling around the twisted cityscape. He clutched his handheld receiver tighter, the device a fragile lifeline amid the chaos. The hidden frequency pulsed erratically, a beacon threading through the storm's violent static. The voices came again, whispers barely audible over the thunder, fragile and urgent. "Help. Trapped. Don't forget us." Elias's breath hitched. They weren't just signals anymore. They were cries from a place stitched into the very fabric of the storm, a liminal realm where reality bled into something else. His footsteps splashed through puddles reflecting fractured neon signs, flickering advertisements that seemed to glitch like corrupted data. The city's usual hum was overwhelmed by the storm's roar, but beneath it, the voices persisted layered, overlapping, a chorus of silent suffering. He rounded a corner, heart pounding as the air thickened with electricity. Images flickered at the edge of his vision, ghostly overlays of shadowed buildings, unfamiliar yet hauntingly familiar. The boundary between worlds was thin here. He could feel it. "Elias, status." Mara's voice crackled urgently in his earpiece. "I'm close," he replied, voice tight. The storm's amplifying the signal. It's like the city's heartbeat, pulsing with another rhythm. "Be careful," she warned. "Crow's agents are closing in." The thought sharpened his senses. Somewhere in the rain-drenched maze, the cold presence of the silent authority lurked, their mechanical voices a sinister counterpoint to the storm's natural fury. Surveillance drones whirred overhead, nearly invisible against the dark clouds. Elias ducked into a narrow alley, the walls slick with rain and static-charged air. He raised his receiver, adjusting the dials, trying to filter the interference. The voices became clearer, fragmented phrases of despair and hope intertwined. "Don't let them silence us. Find the breach. Save us." His mind teetered on the edge of comprehension and madness. The storm's electric tendrils seemed to reach for him, pulling him deeper into a reality where time and space folded unpredictably. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed nearby. Elias spun, heart racing, catching a glimpse of a shadow slipping into the fog, harbinger of the enforcers. He sprinted, rain lashing his face, static buzzing in his ears like a swarm of angry insects. "Elias, this way!" Mara's voice guided him to a hidden alcove where Dr. Sato waited, his pale face illuminated by the flickering stormlights. "The liminal space is destabilizing," Sato said grimly. "You're pushing the boundary too far. If it collapses here, both worlds could suffer irreparable damage." Elias shook his head, resolve hardening. "I have to know. I have to reach them." Together, they adjusted the equipment, trying to stabilize the frequency as the storm's fury crescendoed. Blue sparks danced along wires, syncing with the crackling energy overhead. The voices grew louder, more desperate. Elias closed his eyes, reaching out into the storm's heart. For a moment, the city fell silent, and he stood on the precipice of something vast and unknowable. Then, the world shattered into a kaleidoscope of sound and light, and Elias was no longer certain where he ended and the storm began. The chase was far from over. The silent authority would not relent. And at the storm's edge, the fragile boundary between salvation and oblivion trembled. As the thunder rolled and lightning danced, Elias faced the impossible, to bridge worlds or be consumed by the static forever. The storm was no longer just a backdrop. It was the battleground, and Elias was running out of time. The storm that night was relentless, the city swallowed in a cloak of rain and electrical fury that seemed to pulse with the static hum that had become our constant companion. Mara's voice crackled urgently over the encrypted comm, the sound distorted yet unmistakably tense. "They're coming, Elias. I barely got out. I lost them in the lower alleys, but it was close. Too close." My heart thudded in my chest, a frantic rhythm against the steady drone of the storm outside my window. I gripped the edge of my workstation, the cluttered array of monitors and audio equipment casting flickering shadows across my face. The room was thick with the scent of stale coffee and ozone, the air vibrating faintly with the omnipresent static. "Are you safe now? Where are you?" I asked, voice tight. "Safe enough. For now. I'm heading to the safe house. We need to regroup. They're not just after you. They want to shut us both down." The silent authority had escalated their efforts. Their reach was creeping ever closer, their shadowy presence a constant reminder that our quest was no longer just a personal obsession, but a battle against a faceless, merciless force determined to keep the city and the worlds beyond silent. I glanced at the latest recordings on my screen, the waveform flickering erratically. Among the usual static, I isolated a new voice-fragile urgent, a whisper layered with despair and hope. It was clearer than before, a plaintive plea that pierced the veil of noise. My fingers hovered over the controls, hesitant yet compelled. "Listen," I murmured, pressing play. The voice emerged, a trembling echo from the other side of the storm, a message etched in desperation. "Please, help us. Trapped. Can you hear?" A shiver ran down my spine. The voices were multiplying, their suffering growing more palpable. Each transmission was a thread, pulling me deeper into a labyrinth of lost souls and fractured realities. The weight of their silent screams pressed against my mind, blurring the edges of my own sanity. The door creaked open, and Mara slipped inside, rain dripping from her short hair, eyes sharp and haunted. "They were close," she said quietly. "I think they know what we're doing. Crow's men won't stop until they'd erased every trace." I nodded, swallowing hard. The city's oppressive atmosphere was closing in. The electrical storms no longer just a backdrop, but an active participant in our unfolding nightmare. "We have to keep going," I said, voice resolute despite the fear gnawing at my core. "If we don't, those voices, they'll remain trapped forever." Mara met my gaze, a flicker of fierce loyalty shining through the exhaustion. "Then we find a way, together." As the storm raged on, so did our resolve. The static was no longer just noise. It was a call, a haunting, desperate call that we could not ignore. And as the city trembled beneath the electric sky, I knew the cost of silence was far greater than we had ever imagined. But the question lingered in the charged air. At what price would our voices finally break through the storm? The hunt was no longer just for answers. It was for survival, for connection, for the chance to bring light to the darkest frequencies of existence. And as the night deepened, so did the shadows that watched and waited. I adjusted the dials, the faint echo of a new voice, threading through the static, fragile, yet unmistakable. "Help us. Please." And with that, the storm outside seemed to hold its breath, the city poised on the edge of an uncertain dawn. The small laboratory smelled of ozone and cold metal, the faint hum of machines filling the air like an unending electrical heartbeat. I stood stiffly in the center of the room, my eyes flickering between the array of devices that blinked and pulsed with cryptic data. Dr. Kalen Sato, thin and pale as ever, hovered over a peculiar contraption, a tangle of wires, coils, and screens that seemed to breathe with static energy. His glasses caught the dim light, reflecting 1,000 fractured images that made his gaze impossible to read. "You realize what you're asking," he said, not looking at me, fingers deftly adjusting knobs that sent ripples through the device's low-frequency hum. "This isn't just about listening anymore. We're poking at the very fabric of the liminal space. One wrong move and the feedback could be catastrophic." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like the relentless storm outside. "I know the risks, Kalen, but if we don't try, the voices. The people trapped there, they'll suffer in silence forever." He finally turned to face me, a shadow of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Idealism suits you, Elias, but I've been involved in this research longer than you know. There are stakes far beyond your empathy. The atmosphere between us thickened, charged with unspoken truths. Mara sat quietly in the corner, her sharp eyes betraying her concern. She didn't say a word, but her presence reminded me that I wasn't alone in this, though trust was still a fragile currency in this city. Kalen placed a hand on the device, his fingers trembling slightly. This is an experimental stabilizer designed to anchor the frequency, not just capture it, but hold it steady long enough for coherent communication. But it draws heavily on the city's electromagnetic flux. If the storm intensifies unexpectedly, the city will shake, I finished, knowing all too well the consequences. The storms weren't just weather. They were the pulse of the liminal space itself, unpredictable and violent. We spent hours calibrating the machine, each adjustment met with a symphony of static, crackles, and distorted voices that seemed to leak from another reality. The device responded, its humming deepening into a resonant chord that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. "It's working," Mara whispered, stepping closer to the screens, displaying fluctuating waveforms that danced like ghostly specters. But beneath the excitement, a knot of doubt twisted in my gut. Kellen's eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation, a secret kept close to his chest. I wondered what price he had already paid for this knowledge, and what price we were about to pay. The storm outside raged louder, as if reacting to our intrusion. The boundaries between worlds felt thinner than ever, fragile strands of static threading through the air, whispering promises and threats alike. As the night deepened, our uneasy alliance solidified. Kellen's technology gave me a new weapon against the silence, but also a new enemy in the form of unknown consequences. The gamble to stabilize the liminal space was set, and I was about to find out if hope could survive in the eye of the storm. "We move forward," I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "Together." Kalen nodded, but his eyes remained distant, haunted by shadows I couldn't yet comprehend. Mara reached out, placing a steady hand on my shoulder, a silent vow of solidarity as the lab filled once more with the eerie song of unfathomable frequencies. The game had changed. The static was no longer just noise. It was a battleground, and I was ready to fight. The hum of the city's unending static was a constant companion. But tonight, amidst the buzzing machines and tangled cables of my studio, something shifted. I had spent countless hours dissecting the indecipherable chaos, chasing fragments of sound that teased the edge of comprehension. Now, with the device I'd cobbled together from scavenged parts and relentless tinkering, the hidden broadcast trembled into focus like a fragile thread pulling me toward the unknown. The device was a maze of circuitry, a hybrid amplifier designed not just to boost signal strength, but to filter the noise with a precision I hadn't dared hope for. Dr. Sato had helped me calibrate the electromagnetic lenses, his pale fingers steady despite the flickering uncertainty in his eyes. Mara hovered nearby, her sharp gaze scanning the room for any sign of danger or malfunction, her loyalty a steady anchor in the swirling storm of my obsession. As the first clear voice slipped through, a taut silence fell over the studio. The sound was faint but unmistakably human, a trembling whisper laced with desperation and raw fear. It reached into the core of me, and for a moment, the static ceased to be mere interference. It became a veil, thin and fragile, concealing a world of silent suffering. "Help us," the voice pleaded, fragile as a dying breath. "We're trapped. Please." I froze, breath caught in my throat. Mara's hand brushed my arm, grounding me as the weight of their words settled over us like a shroud. The voices weren't just echoes of some lost broadcast. They were alive, ensnared in a liminal space I barely understood. "Elias," Mara whispered, "we need to be careful. This isn't just data. It's people." Her pragmatism was a balm and a challenge. Could I truly protect us both and still chase the truth. The question gnawed at me as I adjusted the controls, coaxing the device to peel back further layers of static. Dr. Sato's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. You're delving deeper than any safe boundary tonight. The electromagnetic fluctuations could destabilize the liminal space or you. I met his pale gaze, the scientist's warning a cold thread weaving through my determination. But the voices called to me, their fragile pleas echoing inside the hollows left by my own loss. They were trapped, just like my sibling had been, lost to the storms that had shaped this city's dark soul. Over hours that bled into the early morning, the broadcast grew clearer, voices layering into a tapestry of pain and hope. I could hear their stories, fractured, fragmented, but painfully real. They spoke of confinement, of silence forced by shadows beyond the storms, and of an aching desire to reach out, to connect, to be freed. Each message was a shard of emotion, stabbing through my defenses. I recorded them obsessively, the tapes filling with spectral echoes that felt less like signals and more like haunted memories. But the breakthrough came at a cost. The emotional weight pressed down on me, dragging my mind into a tempest of guilt and fear. I questioned my sanity as the voices blended with memories and nightmares, blurring the line between mission and madness. Mara confronted me one evening, her voice steady but edged with concern. Elias, you can't carry this alone. You're slipping away. I nodded, unwilling to admit the truth, that the voices had become a mirror, reflecting my own fractured soul back at me. Yet, beneath the despair, a stubborn flame of hope burned bright. The device was a bridge, fragile but real, and I was the only one who could hold it steady. As the city's storms raged outside, I made a silent vow. I would listen. I would try to understand. And somehow, I would find a way to answer their calls, even if it meant losing myself in the static forever. The first step was clear, to pierce the veil and reach out, to turn the haunting whispers into a chorus of rescue. But the silence that followed the last transmission was thick with uncertainty, a reminder that every discovery would come with shadows. The resonance of the voices had changed everything, and nothing could prepare me for what lay ahead. And yet, I could not turn back. Not now. The storm outside thundered in a relentless rhythm, but inside, a new signal hummed, a fragile promise threaded through the static, waiting to be answered. The studio was alive tonight, but not with life. It breathed in static, exhaled distortion. Elias sat hunched over his array of devices, the room dimly lit by the dull glow of monitors, and the erratic flicker of neon bleeding through the grimy window. The hum of the city's relentless electrical storms was always there, a constant companion. But now the static seemed less like background noise and more like an entity, a presence that curled around the edges of his consciousness, whispering, beckoning. He adjusted the dial on his receiver with trembling fingers, eyes fluttering as the signals warped and twisted, transforming the usual white noise into something disturbingly alive. A pattern emerged, or so he thought at first. Fleeting whispers, sharp bursts of unintelligible speech, and then silence that pressed heavy against his eardrums. His heartbeat quickened, thudding in his chest like a warning drum. Elias. Mara's voice cut through the haze, firm but gentle. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. You've been at this for hours. You need to rest. He shook his head, the static inside his skull rising to a crescendo. They're trying to speak through it, Mara. I can hear them, the trapped voices. But the interference, it's warping everything. I can't tell what's real anymore. Mara stepped inside, closing the door against the storm's howl outside. You're letting it get to you, she said softly. This obsession, it's breaking you. I'm worried. Elias's gaze flickered to her, eyes wild but pleading. If I don't find the truth, if I don't reach them, what happens then? I can't lose them. not like I lost. His voice cracked, the weight of his past loss bleeding into the present. Mara moved closer, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. You're not alone, Elias, but you have to hold on to yourself first. The room seemed to tilt as Elias closed his eyes, the static merging with the memories that haunted him. The voices overlapping with his own thoughts, a chaotic symphony that threatened to drown his sanity. He opened his eyes to the dim light, determination warring with exhaustion. Later, outside, the storm raged with a deafening fury. Elias wandered the wet streets, neon signs flickering above, their colors bleeding into each other like spilled ink. The city was a fractured mirror, reflecting his fractured mind. Every shadow moved with a life of its own. Every crack in the pavement whispered secrets he was desperate to understand. He paused beneath a flickering street lamp, breathing in the sharp scent of ozone and rain. The static still clung to the air, a ghostly residue that wrapped around his senses. He reached for his recorder, fingers numb but steady, capturing the haunting interference that no one else could hear. Back in the studio, night deepened. Elias sat alone, headphones cocooning his ears in a world of static and silence. The voices came again, fragile and desperate, threading through the noise like fragile threads of a tapestry he was desperate to unravel. His breath was shallow, heart a fragile rhythm in the quiet. He was caught between worlds, the known and the unknown, reality and hallucination, hope and despair. Mara's words echoed in his mind, a tether to reality he clung to desperately. The fractures in his mind were widening, the static threatening to swallow him whole. But beneath the fear, beneath the chaos, a stubborn ember of hope burned bright. There were voices out there, trapped, pleading, waiting, and Elias would find a way to reach them, no matter the cost. But as the storm outside began to wane, the static inside him pulsed louder than ever, a fractured symphony that promised both revelation and ruin. The line between signal and noise, sanity and madness, was vanishing. And Elias stood at the edge, teetering between salvation and oblivion. The night was far from over, and the fractures were only beginning to deepen. The air in the underground archive was stifling, thick with the scent of mold and dust that had settled over countless years of secrecy. I stepped cautiously down the narrow metal staircase, the echo of my boots on the concrete floor swallowed beneath the low drone of the storm that raged relentlessly above. Mara followed quietly, her sharp eyes scanning the dim rows of filing cabinets that stretched like tombstones into the shadows. This place was a mausoleum of forgotten truths, a repository of the city's darkest secrets, buried beneath layers of bureaucracy and time. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered sporadically, casting intermittent pools of sickly yellow illumination over stacks of yellowed folders and brittle documents. Each drawer we opened released a faint, oppressive sigh, as if the archive itself resented our intrusion. I felt a chill that wasn't just from the cold. It was the weight of history pressing down on us, the knowledge that what we sought to uncover had been deliberately concealed. Mara handed me a faded file labeled simply Project Threshold, the edges frayed and stained. As I flipped through its pages, the illegible scrawl of bureaucrats and the stark typewritten reports began to paint a picture I had only glimpsed in fragments before. The city's electrical storms, I learned, had not always been mere weather phenomena. Decades ago, during the earliest recorded tempests, inexplicable events had been logged disappearances, anomalous electromagnetic readings, and distortions in reality itself. These incidents had prompted the formation of a covert government agency, an organization known only in these documents as the Silent Authority. The Silent Authority's mandate was chilling in its clarity: to monitor, suppress, and if necessary, eliminate any knowledge or evidence of alternate dimensions intersecting with our own. The documents described a world where dimensions overlapped, fragile thresholds that could be breached by untrained minds or reckless technology. The agency employed surveillance drones, signal jammers, and psychological operations designed to keep the populace ignorant and compliant. As I digested this, a tremor of unease crept through me. This was no longer an abstract mystery. It was a calculated suppression of truth, a war waged in silence beneath the city's ceaseless storms. I glanced at Mara, whose expression was unreadable but resolute. "They knew," she said softly, "all along. And they're still watching." The weight of isolation pressed in. I was no longer just a sound engineer, chasing whispers in the static. I was now a man hunted by an invisible enemy, determined to keep the veil intact. Yet the more I uncovered, the more my obsession deepened. These voices from beyond the storm weren't just echoes. They were cries for salvation from a realm trapped and forgotten. Suddenly, the flicker of light caught my attention. Across the room, a figure emerged from the shadows, Dr. Kalen Sato, his pale face illuminated by the cold glow of a handheld scanner. His presence was both a relief and a puzzle. "You shouldn't be here?" he murmured, voice low but urgent. "The more you dig, the more unstable the signals become. The liminal space is delicate. Interference could collapse the boundary entirely." I swallowed hard, feeling the full gravity of his warning. But retreat was not an option. Not when the truth was so close, when the voices begged for rescue. Together, we scanned the records, cross-referencing electromagnetic data with historical storm activity and agency operations. Patterns emerged, signatures of temporal overlaps, instances of data hauntings recorded in classified logs, and the unsettling realization that the silent authority's suppression extended beyond surveillance into active manipulation of reality itself. Mara's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. "We need to be careful," she said, her usual pragmatism tempered by genuine concern. "If they catch wind of this, it won't just be our equipment at risk." Her words were a sobering reminder of the stakes. Yet, my mind raced with possibility. If these records were accurate, then the city was a nexus, a threshold point between worlds, buffeted by the storms and the static that had become my obsession. Hours passed in the archive's oppressive stillness as we pieced together fragments of a history designed to be forgotten. Each revelation was a shard of light in the darkness, but also a step deeper into a labyrinth of deception and danger. As I closed the final file, the storm outside reached a crescendo, lightning fracturing the sky with jagged fury. The city's hum of static seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, a reminder that the boundary between worlds was thin and trembling. I felt Mara's hand on my shoulder, grounding me. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we face it together." Her loyalty was a balm to my fraying resolve, but I knew the path ahead would test us both. The silent authority was no mere myth. It was the shadow beneath the noise, a sentinel determined to keep the silence. And I was the one who had dared to listen. The archive door slammed shut behind us as we ascended back into the city's charged night, the secrets we carried heavier than the storm itself. With every step, the question loomed, how deep did this conspiracy run, and what price would I pay to expose the truth? The static whispered answers. I could almost grasp promises of rescue, or warnings of oblivion. The storm was no longer just a backdrop. It was the battleground where realities collided and destinies were forged. And I was caught in the eye of it all, a lone sound engineer chasing the fading echoes beneath the noise. The city groaned under the weight of the electrical storm. Outside the lab's grimy windows, jagged forks of lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating the rain-soaked streets in harsh, fleeting flashes. The hum of static was louder than ever, a relentless, omnipresent drone that filled every crevice of the city's battered skyline. Inside, the atmosphere was just as charged, but with a different kind of electricity, the raw, desperate energy of men racing against time. Elias Vorn crouched over the console, his lean fingers flying across dials, sliders, and switches. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the chill of the storm, his dark hair damp and matted. Beside him, Dr. Kalen Sato adjusted a series of antennas and coils, his pale face tense beneath the glare of flickering fluorescent lights. "The storm's electromagnetic flux is off the charts," Sato murmured, voice tight. "If we can synchronize our receivers to the pulses, we might amplify the liminal space's signal enough for a stable transmission. But it's a razor's edge. One miscalculation, and we lose everything." Elias nodded, eyes scanning the fluctuating waveforms on the monitors. The hidden frequency, the one that carried the fragile, desperate voices from beyond, was quivering with unprecedented intensity. The storm was both a curse and a gift, its fury threatening to tear the city apart, even as it provided the raw energy needed to reach through the static veil. "We have to try," Elias said, voice low but resolute. "This could be our only chance to stabilize the channel long enough to send a clear message." Outside, the thunder rumbled like a distant beast, growing louder with each heartbeat. The storm's fury was no longer just an environmental hazard. It was a living, breathing force intertwined with the city's strange liminal fabric. Elias could feel it in his bones, a vibration that pulsed in time with the hidden voices clamoring for rescue. Meanwhile, in a cramped safe house across the city, Mara Lynn's sharp eyes scanned a cluttered wall of monitors and radios. Her short hair was plastered to her head from the damp air, but her voice remained steady as she barked orders into an encrypted radio. "Jocks, status report. Are the signal jammers still active?" Static crackled back, followed by Jocks's gravelly voice. "They're tightening the noose. Crow's drones are swarming the eastern sector. We're holding for now, but the authorities not backing down." Mara's jaw clenched. Protecting Elias and their fragile network had become a perilous dance on a knife's edge. Every transmission risked detection. Every movement could trigger a crackdown. Yet the voices, those faint echoes beyond the storm, demanded their attention, their intervention. Back in the lab, Elias and Sato worked feverishly, aligning antennas to catch the storm's surging pulses. The monitors flickered as power surged through the equipment, the air thick with ozone and tension. Suddenly, the lights flickered and died. The room plunged into darkness as the citywide blackout took hold, a calculated strike by the silent authority to sever their connection. "Damn it," Elias hissed, fumbling for a flashlight. The cold beam cut through the gloom, revealing Sato's pale face etched with frustration. "They're jamming our signals," Sato said grimly. "We need to ride out the blackout, wait for the next surge." Elias's breath hitched as the storm's roar outside seemed to swell, filling the silence with a chaotic symphony. Then, through the static in his headphones, the hidden broadcast surged, clearer, stronger, and piercing through the chaos like a fragile beacon. Ghostly voices whispered through the crackling noise, their tones laden with pain, hope, and a desperate yearning for rescue. Elias's heart pounded as he adjusted the controls, struggling to maintain the tenuous link. "We're through," he whispered, eyes wide with awe. "The liminal space, it's holding, just for a moment." Sato nodded, his usual reserve melting into a rare smile. This is it, but the victory was bittersweet. The storm raged on, the city plunged in darkness, and the unseen eyes of the silent authority weighed heavier than ever. Outside, Mara's voice crackled over the radio, steady and unwavering, a lifeline amidst the tempest. "Elias, hold on. We're not done yet." The moment hung suspended, a fragile thread connecting worlds, a fleeting bridge forged in the heart of a signal storm. But the question remained, could they stabilize this gateway long enough to save the voices trapped beyond? Or would the creeping darkness of control and silence snuff them out forever? The storm showed no signs of abating. Neither did Elias's determination. The battle for connection, for truth, and for rescue had entered its most perilous phase yet. And as the city trembled beneath the storm's wrath, the silent voices waited, hoping, pleading for a salvation that might come at a price no one could yet foresee. The storm was just beginning. The room was thick with static, a familiar presence that had become both Elias's companion and tormentor. His fingers danced over the array of knobs and switches, each adjustment coaxing the fractured signals closer to coherence. The cluttered studio, bathed in the cold blue light of aging monitors and tangled cables, felt like the nerve center of a fragile bridge between worlds. "Hold steady," Elias whispered to himself, eyes narrowing as he watched the waveform dance erratically across the screen. The voices, once indecipherable shards of sound buried beneath relentless interference, began to emerge with startling clarity. They wove together a tapestry of desperation, hope, and silent suffering that transcended the static. Mara leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, her sharp eyes reflecting a mixture of skepticism and growing concern. "It's more than noise now," she said quietly. "You're really hearing them." Elias didn't respond immediately, his focus absolute. The voices overlapped, a chorus of fragile pleas that seemed to echo from a realm caught between existence and oblivion. Each phrase was a thread, and Elias was painstakingly weaving them into a coherent narrative. The trapped realm and echo of the city's storms and shadows was alive with silent agony. "Doctor." Kalen Sato entered quietly, his pale frame almost ghost-like in the subdued light. He approached the holographic displays with a practiced hand, eyes scanning the shifting waveforms. "Fascinating," he murmured, fingers tracing the pulses that pulsed in rhythm with the distant thunder. "These frequencies. They're not just random noise. They're structured, purposeful." Elias glanced up, a flicker of hope lighting his tired eyes. "It's a message. More than that, a cry for rescue." Mara stepped forward, her voice steady despite the tension thickening the air. "If we can understand it, maybe we can help. But this will bring them down on us harder. The silent authority won't like this." Elias nodded, the weight of their unspoken fears pressing heavily. Yet, in the midst of the storm's roar and the persistent hum of static, a fragile connection had been forged, one that promised salvation or destruction. Hours passed as Elias synchronized transmissions, each successful merge unraveling new layers of the trapped realm's story. The voices spoke of confinement, loss, and an unyielding hope for freedom. With every fragment pieced together, Elias felt the boundaries between his reality and theirs blur, the emotional intensity binding him closer to their fate. In the quiet moments between broadcasts, the studio seemed to breathe with the static's pulse, shadows lengthening and retreating like spectral witnesses. Elias's mind swirled with images of the trapped souls, their silent suffering etched into the very fabric of the signals. Mara's presence was a steady anchor. "You can't do this alone," she reminded him gently, her voice a lifeline against the encroaching darkness. Dr. Sato, ever the scientist, continued to analyze the data, offering technical insights that deepened their understanding, but also underscored the peril of their endeavor. "The storms create a liminal space," he explained, "a fragile boundary that these broadcasts are exploiting, but it's unstable. Too much interference, and the whole thing could collapse." The realization tightened the knot in Elias's chest. Each step forward was a gamble, a dance on the edge of oblivion. Yet the voices, once faint whispers, had become a chorus of urgency that he could no longer ignore. As the synchronized broadcast reached its crescendo, Elias slumped into his chair, overwhelmed by the flood of emotion. The voices echoed in his mind, their silent pleas now a haunting symphony that refused to be silenced. Mara placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "We'll figure this out," she promised. "Together." But even as hope flickered in the storm-lit room, the shadow of the silent authority loomed ever closer, their cold interference a reminder that this fragile connection might be the city's last. And somewhere beyond the static, the voices waited united, desperate, and watching. The storm raged on, and with it, the unyielding human urge to reach beyond the known. The moment the monitors went dark, a deafening silence filled Elias's studio. 1 second, the screens were alive with the fractured waveforms of his recordings. The next, a void swallowed every flicker of light and sound. An unnatural quiet settled over the room, broken only by the distant roar of the relentless electrical storm thrashing the city outside. Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. Each beat a frantic countdown to an unknown threat closing in. "They've cut the signal," Mara said sharply, her voice slicing through the stillness as she slammed the studio door behind her. Her sharp eyes darted around the cramped room, taking in the dead equipment and the faint hum of static that now seemed a cruel mockery of their efforts. Elias ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, the weight of the blackout pressing down on him like the storm itself. "It's more than a blackout," he muttered. "They want to erase everything we've uncovered." Mara's jaw tightened. "It's the silent authority. Agent Crow's fingerprints are all over this. They don't want these voices heard." Outside, the city was plunged into darkness. Streetlights winked out one by one, and the usual hum of urban life stuttered into an eerie lull. The storm's electric fury seemed to pulse in tandem with the blackout, as if the city itself was caught in a sinister embrace between natural chaos and human control. "We need to move," Mara urged, her voice low but urgent. "They'll be here any minute." Elias grabbed his coat, the fabric heavy and damp from the storm's persistent drizzle. Together, they slipped out through the back exit, the city's shadows swallowing them whole. The alley was slick with rain, the smell of ozone thick in the air. Distant thunder rumbled, punctuating the tension that coiled in Elias's gut like a living thing. From the corner of his eye, Elias spotted the telltale glint of drone eyes, mechanical watchers, unleashed by the silent authority to hunt them down. The drone's whirring blades cut through the heavy air as they homed in on his position. "Split up," Mara hissed, pulling Elias behind a dumpster. Their breaths came in ragged gasps, hearts pounding a frantic rhythm sensed to the storm's fury. Elias's mind raced. The blackout had been a calculated strike, designed not only to disrupt his work, but to isolate and intimidate him. Yet, despite the overwhelming odds, a fierce ember of defiance burned within him. The voices trapped within the static depended on him, and he would not be silenced. Hours later, as the city's lights flickered back to life and the storm began to wane, Elias and Mara regrouped in a hidden safe house. Their faces were pale, shadows etched deep beneath their eyes. Yet beneath the exhaustion lay a hardened resolve. "This changes everything," Elias said quietly, staring out at the recovering skyline. "They're not just suppressing information. They're trying to erase a truth that could unravel everything." Mara nodded. "We have to be smarter, more careful, but we fight. We expose this, no matter what." The storm had passed, but its shadow lingered. The battle lines were drawn in static and silence, and Elias knew the war for the voices beyond the storm was only just beginning. As dawn threatened to break, a new frequency hummed faintly in the back of Elias's mind, a fragile thread of hope woven through the oppressive quiet. The silent authority had cast a dark shadow over the city, but within that darkness, the signal remained alive, waiting to be heard. Elias closed his eyes, tuning his senses to the whisper beneath the roar. Somewhere beyond the blackout, beyond the storm, the trapped voices called out, and he would answer. The city was a fractured mosaic of light and shadow, a place where technology and nature clashed in a perpetual battle. Tonight, the balance had been violently tipped. The sudden blackout was not just an attack on equipment, it was a message. The silent authority was watching, controlling, and silencing with ruthless precision. Elias and Mara's narrow escape was a testament to their resolve, but also a stark warning. The forces arrayed against them were vast and merciless. The studio, once a sanctuary of sound and discovery, was now a battleground scarred by the echoes of a war fought in frequencies and shadows. Yet even as the city's pulse flickered uncertainly in the aftermath of the assault, Elias felt a strange kinship with the silence. It was not empty. It was charged with potential. The static held secrets, residual energy from the lost transmissions, and perhaps a pathway forward. Mara's steady presence grounded him, a beacon amid the chaos. Despite their differences, her skepticism, his obsession, they were bound by a shared purpose to uncover the truth hidden beneath layers of interference. Agent Crow's cold, mechanical voice haunted Elias's thoughts. It was a symbol of the impersonal force that sought to control knowledge and suppress connection. But Elias was no longer just a passive listener. He was a participant in a larger struggle that transcended the boundaries of worlds. Inside the safe house, the air was thick with the smell of brewing coffee and quiet conversation. Plans were whispered, equipment repurposed, and alliances forged in the crucible of necessity. The fight against the silent authority was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming the right to hear the unheard. As the first light of dawn filtered through cracked windows, Elias felt the weight of his mission settle firmly on his shoulders. The storm had passed, but the real tempest was yet to come. And when it did, he would be ready to face the shadow that loomed over the city and the voices caught within its static veil. The battle for connection, for truth, and for freedom was just beginning. The static was louder than usual in the cramped studio that evening, a relentless hum that filled every crevice with its unyielding presence. Elias sat hunched over his console, eyes bloodshot and fixed on the erratic waveforms that danced across the screen. His fingers moved almost mechanically, adjusting dials, replaying fragments of the hidden frequency, chasing after voices that seemed to slip further away with every listen. Mara stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with a blend of frustration and fear. The low light cast angular shadows across her sharp features, the short strands of hair framing her face like a shield. "Elias," she said quietly, her voice cutting through the static haze, "you need to stop. That obsession is killing you." He didn't look up. "I'm close, Mara. I can feel it. These voices, they're more than just noise. They're trapped, and I'm the only one who can help." "You're losing yourself," she pressed, stepping forward, the concern in her eyes unmistakable. "You haven't slept properly in days. You're talking about hallucinations like they're facts. And what about us? You're shutting me out." For a moment, Elias's hands faltered on the controls. The static filled the silence between them, a relentless reminder of the world he was so determined to save and the one he was fracturing around himself. "I'm not shutting you out," he whispered, voice cracking. "I just need you to understand, this frequency, it's a lifeline. If I don't reach them, no one will." Mara's expression softened, but her resolve remained firm. "And what if you lose yourself in the process? What good is saving others if you're gone?" The storm outside raged on, lightning illuminating the city through the grimy windows, flickering like fractured memories. Elias turned to her then, eyes searching. "I don't know how to stop. Not now." Their conversation spiraled into silence as the weight of unspoken fears settled between them. Days bled into nights with little rest, Elias's mind a battleground of static and shadows. The voices grew louder in his head, sometimes indistinguishable from the storm's own howling. Paranoia crept in, twisting his perceptions. He found himself double-checking equipment, suspecting invisible watchers, questioning even Mara's intentions. One night, on the rain-soaked rooftop overlooking the city, Mara confronted him again. The neon signs flickered erratically, casting eerie glows on their faces. "You're slipping away from me," she said, voice raw with emotion. "If you disappear into this obsession, I don't know if I can follow." Elias's reply was a whisper torn between hope and despair. I'm trying to save them. But maybe I'm losing myself instead. The storm's electric charge crackled in the air, mirroring the tension between them. They stood apart, silhouettes against the fractured cityscape, the distance between them as palpable as the static that enveloped everything. Back inside, Elias's trembling hands grappled with the equipment, desperate to hold on to the fragile tether of reality. The broadcasts warped and shifted, bleeding into his thoughts, the line between what was real and imagined blurring with every pulse. Mara watched him, heart heavy, torn between fear for his sanity and unwavering loyalty. In the quiet afterward, at Mara's apartment, the city's storm dimmed to a distant murmur. They sat together in fragile silence, the room thick with the weight of what had been said and left unsaid. In that stillness, a tentative understanding began to take root, fragile as the dawn light creeping through the blinds. But the fractures remained, a reminder that their bond, like the signals Elias chased, was fragile and fraught with uncertainty. The path ahead was unclear, the cost of connection steep, and the storm both external and internal far from over. As the night deepened, Elias's thoughts raced. Could he find balance between the consuming obsession and the fragile ties that anchored him? Or would the static finally claim him, silencing both his voice and the calls he was desperate to answer? The hum of the city outside whispered promises of both hope and dread, a reminder that some connections demanded sacrifice beyond measure. And as the first faint crackle of an elusive signal surfaced amidst the static, Elias knew the next step would define not just his fate, but the fate of the voices trapped beyond the storm. He reached for the controls once more, determination flickering in his tired eyes. The journey was far from over. The rooftop was an island amid the tempest, a battleground where storm and city clashed in a cacophony of raw energy. Elias Vorn stood at its edge, the modified transdimensional device strapped securely to his chest, glowing faintly with a cold blue light that seemed almost unnatural against the dark, flickering sky. Lightning stitched jagged seams across the horizon, illuminating the endless sheets of rain that hammered down like 1,000 tiny fists. The static was louder here, a deafening hum that thrummed in his bones and whispered secrets in every crackle. His breath came in ragged bursts, the cold air burning his lungs with each inhale. The city sprawled beneath him, a maze of neon lights and shadowed alleys, but it felt distant, disconnected from the tempest that raged above. Tonight was the night he would cross the threshold, descend into the liminal space that had mocked him through the static for so long. Elias Mara's voice crackled through the earpiece, steady but strained, the storms intensifying. Are you sure you want to do this now? He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the device's controls. I have to. If I don't take the step now, the connection will be lost. The voices, they're fading. A sharp crack of thunder rolled overhead, shaking the very air. Elias pressed the activation button. The device pulsed, a wave of electromagnetic energy rippling outward, distorting the space around him. The world blurred, colors bleeding into one another as edges lost definition. He felt his body dissolve into the noise, the tactile reality of the rooftop slipping away. Suddenly, he was somewhere else. Or perhaps everywhere at once. The liminal space was a fractured mirror of the city. Buildings twisted into impossible angles, their surfaces shimmering like heat haze. Neon signs flickered erratically, their messages garbled and half-formed. The sky above was a roiling canvas of static and storm clouds, fractured by jagged bolts of light that seemed to crack the space itself. Voices floated through the haze, fragile, desperate, pleading. They whispered his name, weaving sorrow and hope into their tangled chorus. Elias reached out, trying to grasp the intangible threads, but they slipped through his fingers like smoke. His heart pounded as the boundaries between reality and hallucination blurred. He saw flashes of another world layered beneath this one, shadowy figures trapped behind invisible barriers, eyes wide with silent screams. The static was alive here, a sentient veil that both concealed and imprisoned. Back in the studio, Mara's gaze was fixed on the monitors, her fingers dancing across keyboards as she fought to stabilize the feed. The storm's interference was relentless, scrambling. The air inside the liminal zone was thick with a palpable static, yet beneath it pulsed an eerie silence that seemed to press against my eardrums. Shadows flickered and shifted around me like restless phantoms, their forms half glimpsed, yet unmistakably human. Each step I took sent ripples through the ambient hum, fracturing the tenuous veil separating our worlds. I gripped the worn edges of my portable receiver, its screen flickering erratically, as if struggling to anchor itself in this unstable reality. The trapped voices wove around me, their whispers fragile but insistent. They were not mere echoes, but entities caught in the interstice, their suffering etched in every tremor of the signal. A sudden chill brushed the back of my neck, a presence manifesting just beyond perception. From the shifting gloom emerged a figure, my own reflection, but distorted, spectral, and cold. The doppelganger's eyes bore into me, hollow yet accusing, reflecting the fears and guilt I had buried beneath years of isolation. "Why do you linger here, Elias?" The apparition seemed to ask without words. "What do you hope to save when you yourself are breaking?" I faltered, the weight of my obsession pressing down like the crushing storm outside. The boundary between my mind and the liminal space blurred, hallucinations and reality entwining into a chaotic dance. Yet, within that chaos, I found a sliver of clarity, a purpose that transcended the static noise. Suddenly, a cold mechanical voice cut through the spectral murmurs. Connection unstable. Severance imminent, it intoned, the unmistakable signature of the silent authority. Their presence was a shadow cast over this fragile sanctuary, an oppressive force bent on maintaining the veil between worlds. Their interference grew more aggressive, signals jamming, echoes of digital snarls disrupting the delicate communion I had forged. I fought to steady my breathing, to anchor myself against the rising tide of disorientation. The trapped voices surged in intensity, their pleas a chorus of desperation and hope. I reached out, hands trembling, to touch the flickering forms, ghostly silhouettes, shimmering with ephemeral light. Their eyes, filled with silent suffering, locked onto mine, and in that moment I understood the depth of their imprisonment. Through the haze of static and shadow, I found strength. The spectral reflection of my fears wavered and dissolved as I embraced the connection fully, letting the voices fill the void inside me. This was not merely a battle of technology or will, it was a communion of fractured souls seeking redemption through one another. As the mechanical voice of the silent authority grew louder, threatening to sever the link, I steeled myself for the coming storm. The liminal space trembled, its fragile boundaries quivering under the assault, but I would not yield. For the voices, for the lost, for myself, I would stand against the silence. The echoes of my heartbeat mingled with the distant thunder beyond the veil, a steady reminder that even in the darkest static, life persisted. And with that thought, I pushed forward into the unknown, ready to face whatever lay beyond the storm. The studio was suffocating under a thick blanket of static that no longer whispered but screamed. Elias sat slumped in his chair, eyes fixed on the flickering monitors that had once been his window to another world. Now, they were nothing but broken glass reflecting a fractured reality. The equipment, once his trusted companion, had betrayed him. Circuits fried, signals drowned in relentless interference. The cold hum of failure filled the room, a mechanical dirge that echoed the turmoil within his mind. He reached out hesitantly, fingers brushing the cracked speaker cone, the last fragile conduit of the voices he had come to know so intimately. The static pulsed ominously, as if mocking his efforts, each wave a reminder of the connection slipping through his grasp. The voices, the desperate pleas, the fragile hopes were now drowned in a void of silence that threatened to consume not just the signals but his very purpose. Time slipped unnoticed until the door burst open with a sharp crack, rainwater splattering across the warm floorboards. Mara stood there, soaked and breathless, her sharp eyes blazing with urgency. "Elias," she said, voice steady yet edged with worry, "you need to stop this. You need to rest." He shook his head, voice hoarse. "I can't. Not yet. The voices, they're still out there. I have to reach them." Mara stepped closer, her presence a tether to the world he was fading from. "And I'm going to help you. But you can't do this alone." Outside, the city writhed beneath storm-darkened skies, neon lights flickering like dying stars. The oppressive hum of the electrical tempest seeped through the walls, a constant reminder of the forces conspiring to silence him. Minutes later, Dr. Kalen Sato arrived, his pale figure framed by the dim hallway light. He moved with the precision of a surgeon, his fingers deftly adjusting dials and rewiring connections among the tangled mess of equipment. His glasses caught the glow of flickering screens, reflecting a mind grappling with the impossible. "The interference is unlike anything I've seen," he muttered. "It's adaptive, overwhelming. But there's a pattern if we can isolate it. Perhaps we can counteract it." Elias watched, a mix of hope and desperation burning behind tired eyes. The scientist's cold determination was a fragile lifeline in a sea of chaos. Hours passed in a blur of static and whispered calculations. Yet, despite their efforts, the signals remained broken, fragmented beyond comprehension. Elias felt the walls of his sanity closing in, memories and hallucinations blurring the line between reality and the haunting broadcasts. The voices sometimes echoed in his thoughts, distorted cries slipping through the cracks of his fractured mind. In a rare moment of clarity, Elias spoke softly. "What if this is it? What if the static wins?" Mira's hand found his, grounding him. "Then we fight harder, because there's more at stake than just sound. There's hope." The night deepened, the storm outside reaching a crescendo. Elias stared at the darkened monitors, a silent promise forming in his heart. The connection might be broken, but the voices were not lost. Somewhere beyond the storm, beyond the static, they wait, and he would find a way back to them. As the first hints of dawn crept through rain-streaked windows, a faint pulse flickered on the screen, a fragile heartbeat in the void. Elias's breath caught. The signal had not died. Not yet. With renewed resolve, he whispered into the stillness, "I'm coming." The storm raged on, but within the shattered silence, a new hope was born. The studio was a sanctuary of shadows and static, a cocoon where the hum of electricity and the faint crackle of interference were constant companions. Elias sat hunched over his console, fingers trembling slightly as he made final adjustments to the device that had consumed his every waking thought for weeks. The repaired apparatus, a tangled mesh of wires and salvaged components, now pulsed with a steady blue light, a beacon in the otherwise dim and cluttered room. A faint vibration thrummed through the air, a subtle shift in the static that signaled something new, something different. Elias's heart pounded as he leaned in, eyes fixed on the wavering lines across the screen. The familiar hiss of white noise was punctuated by something else, a pattern, a rhythm, a voice. "Listen," Elias whispered, barely daring to break the fragile silence. Mara, standing close behind him, leaned forward, her sharp eyes narrowing as she scanned the audio waveforms. The room seemed to hold its breath. From the speakers emerged a voice fragile, trembling, layered beneath the interference, but undeniably human. "Help. Trapped. Please." The words were disjointed, fragmented, but their desperate urgency cut through the static like a knife. Mara's breath hitched, a rare crack in her usual pragmatism. "Elias, they're real. Across the room, Dr. Kalen Sato adjusted his glasses, his pale face etched with a mixture of fascination and dread. This transmission, it's unlike anything I've encountered. The energy signatures suggest a dimensional bleed, an overlap created by the city's storms. But the psychological toll, the voices, they speak of imprisonment beyond physical confinement. Elias swallowed hard, his own mind racing to grasp the implications. The voices weren't just echoes or hallucinations. They were trapped consciousnesses, prisoners of a liminal space forged by the city's relentless electrical storms. Each plea was a thread in a tapestry of silent suffering, woven into signals that defied conventional science. Their suffering, Elias murmured, voice thick with emotion. And it's because of us, because of this city, this storm, this interference. Mara placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Then we have to do something. The device crackled again, and a new message began to form longer, clearer. The voices spoke of fractures in reality, of a cost paid in isolation and pain, their existence tethered precariously between worlds. They described attempts to reach out, to connect, only to be met with silence or suppression. The message was a call for rescue, a plea to break the chains of their multidimensional prison. Dr. Sato's voice was low, almost reverent. This is the cost of crossing worlds, the sacrifice of identity, stability, even sanity. If we interfere recklessly, we risk everything. Elias felt a weight settle in his chest, the enormity of the task dawning on him. This was no longer a mere investigation or a technical challenge. It was a mission fraught with peril, with stakes that transcended his own survival. "We can't turn away," he said firmly, eyes meeting Mara's. They trusted us to listen. Now, we have to find a way to answer. Outside, the city groaned under the relentless storm, flashes of lightning illuminating the rain-slicked streets. Inside the studio, the trio sat in a heavy silence, the haunting message playing on repeat. The voices from beyond the static were no longer distant whispers. They were a summons, a responsibility. Elias's fingers hovered over the controls, a mixture of dread and determination coursing through him. The path ahead was uncertain and dangerous, but the reverberations of this moment would echo far beyond the confines of his studio. The storm outside raged on, but within, a fragile hope flickered amidst the static. The city's night was thick with electric tension, the air crackling with charged particles that danced invisibly through the dense fog of static. Elias sat hunched over his array of monitors in the musty warehouse that had become their refuge, a fortress cobbled together from scavenged tech and whispered secrets. His fingers moved deftly across the consoles, isolating fragments of transmissions buried beneath layers of interference. Beside him, Mara leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the spectral data with relentless focus. "They're ramping up," Elias murmured, voice hoarse but steady. "Signal jammers are getting stronger, and the psychological tactics, they're trying to wear me down." Mara's jaw tightened. "We expected as much. The silent authority won't let this go quietly. But neither will we. Not now." Outside, the city groaned under the weight of its own storms, neon lights flickering like dying pulses in the ceaseless downpour. Somewhere beyond the cracked windows, the low hum of surveillance drones buzzed intermittently, a constant reminder of the eyes watching their every move. Dr. Kalen Sato entered quietly, clutching a bulky case filled with experimental equipment. His pale face was drawn, eyes reflecting the dim glow of the monitors. "I've managed to calibrate the new shielding device," he announced, setting the case down with a soft clank. "It should dampen the jamming signals long enough for us to transmit without interruption." Elias allowed himself a brief, grateful glance. Every second counts. The trio worked in strained harmony, the atmosphere thick with urgency. Mara tapped a series of commands into her tablet, rerouting their data streams through convoluted pathways designed to confuse the city's omnipresent surveillance. Elias adjusted the frequency modulators, fine-tuning their broadcast to slip beneath the electronic radar. Suddenly, the warehouse was swallowed by darkness. The power grid had been cut. The monitors blinked off, and the only sound was the relentless storm battering the walls. "Backup generators," Mara barked, scrambling toward the side room where the crude power source was stored. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as panic threatened to rise. The silence was suffocating. "Keep calm," Mara's voice crackled over the emergency radio. "We're not done yet." Minutes later, the hum of the generator filled the room, and the monitors flickered back to life. Their screens displayed a new challenge, a distorted broadcast hijacking their channel. A cold, mechanical voice echoed through the static, laced with menace and finality. "Cease all transmissions. You endanger the balance. Resistance is futile." Elias gritted his teeth, anger flaring beneath the exhaustion. "They think they can scare us into submission, but they don't understand. This is bigger than fear." Mara placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Then let's show them what we're made of." Together, they mapped out their counter-strategy. All eyes from the city's underground tech circles were mobilized. Hidden caches of equipment were secured. Dr. Sato's shielding device would provide the crucial window to send their message without interception. As the storm outside raged with renewed fury, inside the warehouse, a different kind of battle was unfolding. A silent resistance against control, censorship, and the erasure of truth. Elias felt the weight of every whispered voice, every fragment of static that carried hope and despair intertwined. "We're on the edge," he said softly, "but we're not alone." The city's relentless static seemed to seep into every corner of my consciousness, a creeping fog that blurred the lines between what was real and what was conjured by my unraveling mind. Night after night, I sat in the cramped walls of my studio, the air thick with the scent of burnt circuits and stale coffee, as the incessant hum of interference pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the surface of all sound. My fingers trembled over the control panel, every dial and slider a fragile thread, tethering me to sanity or driving me further into the abyss. Mara's sharp voice cut through the haze one evening, her presence a rare anchor. "Elias, you need to step back," she urged, her eyes scanning the flickering screens that danced with static and ghostly fragments of voices. "This isn't just signal distortion anymore. It's you. You're losing yourself in it." I wanted to argue, to insist that the voices beyond the static were real, that they needed me, that my obsession was a lifeline to a truth no one else could perceive. But the shadows lurking behind my eyelids and the whispering static that bled into my thoughts spoke a different language, one of fractured memories and fading certainty. One night, as the storm outside raged with a fury that matched the chaos inside my head, the walls of my studio seemed to dissolve. The static warped into shapes' faces made of flickering light and crackling noise, reaching out with translucent hands woven from the very deadest dreams I chased. Their eyes held a silent plea, a torment I could feel as keenly as my own pulse. I reached toward them, desperation clawing at my throat, but the shapes flickered and vanished like smoke. Mara's footsteps echoed through the corridor, firm and insistent. "Elias, please," she said, her voice a fragile bridge to reality. "You're slipping. We can fight this together, but you have to hold on." I wanted to believe her, to cling to the warmth of her concern amid the cold machinery and spectral hauntings. Yet the fissures in my mind widened, memories colliding with hallucinations and fragments of broadcasted voices, creating a mosaic that defied logic. The weight of loss, the sibling I never properly mourned, pressed down, and the static whispered blame and sorrow in equal measure. Dr. Sato's sterile lab was a stark contrast to my cluttered sanctuary. He pored over my recordings with clinical detachment, his pale eyes reflecting data streams rather than empathy. Elias, he said quietly, the electromagnetic anomalies you're encountering are unlike anything I've seen. But your mental state, this obsession, is destructive. We must find a balance between scientific inquiry and your well-being. His words settled uneasily in the charged air. I knew he was right. Yet surrender felt like betrayal to the voices trapped beyond the veil, to the city suffocating beneath the storms, and to the fragile hope that flickered like a dying star within me. Mara stayed close, her presence a fragile tether to the world I was on the verge of losing. But even her fierce loyalty was tested as I retreated deeper into the labyrinth of signals and shadows, my mind fraying at the edges. As the storm outside reached a crescendo, so did the tempest within. I was caught between worlds, haunted by the fragile promise of rescue and the terrifying possibility of permanent descent into static silence. The question loomed, how long before the voices I sought to save consumed me entirely? The night stretched on, unyielding and electric, as the city's pulse beat in tandem with mine, an echo of isolation, desperation, and the faintest glimmer of hope. The city's night was thick with electric tension, the air crackling with charged particles that danced invisibly through the dense fog of static. Elias sat hunched over his array of monitors in the musty warehouse that had become their refuge, a fortress cobbled together from scavenged tech and whispered secrets. His fingers moved deftly across the consoles, isolating fragments of transmissions buried beneath layers of interference. Beside him, Mara leaned forward, her sharp eyes scanning the spectral data with relentless focus. They're ramping up, Elias murmured, voice hoarse but steady. Signal jammers are getting stronger, and the psychological tactics, they're trying to wear me down. Mara's jaw tightened. We expected as much. The silent authority won't let this go quietly. But neither will we. Not now. Outside, the city groaned under the weight of its own storms, neon lights flickering like dying pulses in the ceaseless downpour. Somewhere beyond the cracked windows, the low hum of surveillance drones buzzed intermittently, a constant reminder of the eyes watching their every move. Dr. Kalen Sato entered quietly, clutching a bulky case filled with experimental equipment. His pale face was drawn, eyes reflecting the dim glow of the monitors. I've managed to calibrate the new shielding device, he announced, setting the case down with a soft clank. It should dampen the jamming signals long enough for us to transmit without interruption. Elias allowed himself a brief, grateful glance. Every second counts. The trio worked in strained harmony, the atmosphere thick with urgency. Mara tapped a series of commands into her tablet, rerouting their data streams through convoluted pathways designed to confuse the city's omnipresent surveillance. Elias adjusted the frequency modulators, fine-tuning their broadcast to slip beneath the electronic radar. Suddenly, the warehouse was swallowed by darkness. The power grid had been cut. The monitors blinked off, and the only sound was the relentless storm battering the walls. Backup generators, Mara barked, scrambling toward the side room where the crude power source was stored. Elias's heart pounded in his chest as panic threatened to rise. The silence was suffocating. Keep calm, Mara's voice crackled over the emergency radio. We're not done yet. Minutes later, the hum of the generator filled the room, and the monitors flickered back to life. Their screens displayed a new challenge, a distorted broadcast hijacking their channel. A cold, mechanical voice echoed through the static, laced with menace and finality. Cease all transmissions. You endanger the balance. Resistance is futile. Elias gritted his teeth, anger flaring beneath the exhaustion. They think they can scare us into submission, but they don't understand. This is bigger than fear. Mara placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. Then let's show them what we're made of. Together, they mapped out their counter-strategy. All eyes from the city's underground tech circles were mobilized. Hidden caches of equipment were secured. Dr. Sato's shielding device would provide the crucial window to send their message without interception. As the storm outside raged with renewed fury, inside the warehouse, a different kind of battle was unfolding. A silent resistance against control, censorship, and the erasure of truth. Elias felt the weight of every whispered voice, every fragment of static that carried hope and despair intertwined. "We're on the edge," he said softly, "but we're not alone." The relentless storm raged above the city, a furious tempest that seemed to echo the turmoil swelling within me. I stood at the edge of the liminal nexus, the very heart of the storm's chaotic energy, cradling the device I had spent countless sleepless nights perfecting. The air was thick with charged particles, crackling and shimmering like a living entity around me, while jagged bolts of lightning fractured the sky in violent bursts. Every instinct screamed for caution, but retreat was no longer an option. The voices, the fragile, desperate pleas were within reach, and I had to protect them. A sudden shadow shifted through the rain-soaked haze. Agent Crow emerged, his silhouette etched sharply against the flashing backdrop of electric fury. He was the embodiment of the silent authority's cold, unyielding grip on this city, a force intent on preserving the veil between worlds at any cost. His voice crackled through the static, amplified by a concealed comlink. "Cold and mechanical, Elias Vorn, this is your final warning. Cease your interference immediately, or face consequences you cannot withstand." I swallowed the knot forming in my throat and met his gaze with the steely resolve that had carried me this far. "I won't let you silence them," I said, my voice steady despite the tremor in my fingers. "They deserve to be heard." Crow's lip twitched in a semblance of a sneer, but he said nothing more. Instead, his agent's shadowy figures, moving like ghosts, began deploying signal jammers and interference devices around the perimeter. The air was thickening with electromagnetic disruption, the very fabric of the liminal space quivering under assault. I hastily adjusted the dials, the device emitting a low, urgent hum that cut through the storm's roar. The hidden frequency screamed in response, a cacophony of fragmented voices and anguished cries, interwoven with static that felt almost alive. I could feel the boundary between worlds flickering, reality warping into a shimmering distortion that bent the light and sound around me. Memories surged unbidden, my sibling's vanished face, lost to the storms years ago. Mara's worried eyes, Dr. Sato's cautious warnings. Each was a thread in the tapestry of my obsession, each a reminder of what was at stake. I fought to maintain clarity, to anchor myself against the encroaching madness that the static seemed to whisper. Crow advanced, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You can't win this, Elias. The authority controls the narrative, the signals, the silence. Surrender now." I shook my head, fingers flying over the controls, desperate to stabilize the signal. The interference surged, a tidal wave of noise that threatened to drown out the voices I had come so far to save. Shadows crept at the edge of my vision, spectral forms born of static and fear. For a moment, I teetered on the brink of collapse, mind fracturing under the pressure. But then a sudden clarity, a breakthrough. The device pulsed with renewed energy, the signal coalescing into a coherent broadcast. The voices became distinct, their pleas no longer lost in the abyss. I sent the transmission a clear, resonant message that transcended the storms and the silence imposed by the silent authority. The static screamed in protest, the liminal space convulsing violently around me. Crow's expression faltered, his control slipping as the boundary between worlds held firm. "This isn't over," he hissed before retreating into the tempest. I collapsed to my knees, every muscle trembling with exhaustion and relief. The storm still raged, but a fragile hope had been kindled, a beacon in the darkness. The voices were heard. The trapped souls were not forgotten. As the first light of dawn struggled to pierce through the dissipating clouds, I knew the fight was far from over. But in this moment, amidst the ruins of control and the chaos of the storm, I had carved a path toward freedom, and I would walk it, no matter the cost. The city around me was silent but alive, a living testament to the battle waged in the unseen frequencies. Somewhere beyond the veil, the voices answered back, fragile, hopeful, waiting. And I would be their guardian until the storm finally broke. The confrontation had ended, but the echo of its fury would resonate forever. The static was no longer just noise. It was a call to arms, a challenge to the silence, and a promise that even in the darkest storms, connection could still be found. I rose slowly, looking out over the city that had become both prison and battleground. The next chapter awaited, uncertain and vast. But for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. This is only the beginning, I whispered to the fading storm, to the voices, to myself. And I will not fail them. The horizon flickered with the first hints of a dawn that might one day break free from the static's grasp. Until then, the fight would continue in the shadows, in the signals, and in the heart of the storm. The storm outside howled like an ancient beast, its relentless fury battering the city's skeletal skyline. Inside the cramped, cluttered room that served as Elias's sanctuary, the hum of machines and the crackle of static formed an eerie symphony. Screens flickered erratically, casting ghostly shadows across the walls, while the air vibrated with the faint but urgent voices from a realm beyond understanding. Elias stood at the center of it all, his fingers deftly adjusting dials and sliding faders on the device he had painstakingly engineered over weeks of obsession and sleepless nights. The machine's core glowed faintly, pulsing with invisible energy that seemed to bridge two realities. His tired eyes, ringed with dark circles, reflected both the swirling chaos of the storm outside and the fragile hope flickering within the hidden broadcasts. "It's now or never," he whispered, voice barely audible above the static. His heart pounded, a wild metronome marking the final moments of a journey that had consumed every fiber of his being. Mara stood nearby, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her sharp gaze never left Elias, a tether grounded in the storm's eye. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, voice trembling with a mix of fear and fierce loyalty. He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "If I don't do this, they'll be lost forever." "And so will I." Dr. Kalen Sato hovered near a bank of monitors, his pale face illuminated by data streams and graphs. "The energy surge from the storm is peaking. This window won't last long. You have to initiate the sequence now." Elias took a deep breath, steeling himself. The device emitted a low hum, intertwining with the storm's roar as he engaged the final protocol. The static thickened, voices rising in a crescendo of desperate whispers and fragile hope. Each syllable seemed to pierce the very fabric of reality, begging for deliverance. Suddenly, a harsh, mechanical voice crackled through a concealed speaker. Agent Crow's cold, commanding tone cutting through the room like a blade. "Cease transmission immediately. This is your final warning." Elias's hands trembled for a moment, but he met the unseen threat with unwavering resolve. "No, this ends tonight." The room vibrated violently as the device surged, drawing power from the storm's raw energy. The voices coalesced into a clear chorus, echoing gratitude and relief. Elias felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, a bittersweet fusion of pain and peace. His vision blurred, the sterile walls melting away into a shimmering void where light and shadow danced in an endless embrace. The liminal space welcomed him, the voices now tangible presences wrapping around his consciousness like a fragile embrace. Mara's voice, distant but resolute, called out to him as he began to fade. "Elias, remember us. Remember who you are." His final thought was a promise that no matter the cost, he had bridged the impossible, and in doing so, had given them all a chance at salvation. As the storm outside began to wane and the oppressive static lifted from the city's veins, a new silence settled. It was not an empty silence, but one filled with the quiet echoes of hope and the lingering hum of a connection forged beyond worlds. In the aftermath, Mara and Dr. Sato stood amidst the ruins of the storm-battered lab, their eyes heavy with loss, but shining with the faintest glimmer of hope. Elias was gone, but his sacrifice had changed everything. The city static was no longer a veil of despair, but a fragile thread linking worlds, a testament to the power of courage, sacrifice, and the human urge to reach beyond the known. And somewhere, in the space between realities, Elias's voice whispered on, a haunting, hopeful echo that refused to be silenced. The story was far from over. The quiet between storms held new secrets, new possibilities, and the promise that connection, no matter how tenuous, could endure even the darkest night. And so, as the first faint light of dawn crept over the horizon, the city held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The city was breathing again, if only faintly. Where once the relentless electrical storms had raged without end, shrouding every street and alleyway in crackling static, a tentative calm had settled over the urban sprawl. From the vantage of a weathered rooftop, Mara Lynn gazed out across the skyline. The obsidian clouds that had loomed for years were breaking apart, giving way to rare glimpses of pale, diffuse sunlight struggling through a thinning veil. The oppressive hum of static was no longer a constant companion. Instead, an uneasy silence hung in the air, punctuated only by occasional distant rumbles, like the dying heartbeat of a long torment. Mara's eyes, sharp as ever despite the exhaustion stitched into her features, scanned the horizon. The city looked different, lighter, almost fragile in its newfound stillness. But beneath the surface, the scars remained. Buildings bore the faint scorch marks of lightning strikes. Streetlights flickered sporadically, and the usual clamor of urban life was tinged with a cautious restraint, as if the citizens themselves were holding their breath. She tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear and let out a slow breath, the weight of recent months pressing down on her chest. Elias was gone. His voice, once a constant presence in her life and work, now only echoed faintly in the recordings and memories she kept. Yet his sacrifice had not been in vain. The hidden broadcasts, the fragile voices trapped beyond the storm, had been freed. Mara could still hear their whispers in the static, now clearer, no longer drowned beneath the relentless electrical noise. Down below, the streets were stirring with cautious optimism. Vendors tentatively resumed their trade. Children played in parks where puddles reflected the clearing sky. The city was tentative but alive. Inside a modest laboratory, not far from the city center, Dr. Kalen Sato sat hunched over a bank of softly glowing monitors. The thin scientist's pale face was cast in the cool blue of data streams, his eyes darting back and forth as he analyzed the latest electromagnetic readings. The storm's signature frequencies were diminishing steadily, the once frenetic patterns of interference now replaced by a calm, almost natural baseline. It was as if the city itself was exhaling after a long-held breath. Incredible, Sato murmured, adjusting the lenses on his glasses. The liminal space is stabilizing. Elias's final transmission must have altered the electromagnetic field, creating a new equilibrium. His fingers danced over the keyboard, running simulations. If this holds, we're witnessing the birth of a new era, one where the boundary between worlds is no longer a prison, but a bridge. Yet even as hope flickered, uncertainty gnawed at him. Elias's disappearance left a void, a question mark hovering over every breakthrough. What had become of the man who had given everything to send that final message? Was he lost within the liminal space, or had he transcended to some other existence? Later that evening, Mara met Dr. Sato in a quiet, dimly lit cafe nestled between the steel and glass monoliths of the city. The smell of roasted coffee and the murmur of distant conversations surrounded them as they sat across from each other, their faces etched with the shared burden of grief and hope. It's strange, Mara confessed, to feel relief and sorrow at the same time. A city is healing, but Elias, he's not here to see it. Sato nodded, his expression grave yet resolute. His work paved the way. It's up to us now to understand, to protect, and to learn from what he uncovered. The storms may have quieted, but the mysteries remain. They spoke quietly of the future plans to publish findings, to advocate for transparency about the city's hidden dimensions, to honor Elias's memory by continuing the mission he had begun. Yet beneath their words lingered the unspoken fear that the liminal space, though stable for now, was an unknown frontier fraught with dangers yet unseen. Outside, as night deepened, a small crowd gathered around a street vendor's radio. The device crackled to life, emitting a clear, haunting broadcast, the voices freed from their prison, now reaching out across the divide. Gasps and whispers spread through the onlookers, a collective acknowledgement of something extraordinary. Mara watched from a distance, her heart both heavy and lifted. The city was changing, and with it, the fragile threads of connection that bound reality to the beyond. Elias's voice was gone, but his message endured an echo beyond the storm, a promise of redemption that refused to be silenced. As the first stars pierced the clearing sky, Mara felt a renewed sense of purpose. The long night was ending, but the journey was far from over. Somewhere in the liminal space between worlds, Elias's consciousness persisted, an unseen guardian watching over the fragile bridge they had built. And as dawn approached, the city held its breath once more, poised on the edge of a new beginning. The studio was silent, except for the low hum of the machines and the faint crackle of old static as Mara Lynn settled into Elias's worn leather chair. Around her, the clutter of tangled wires, scattered papers, and myriad recording devices formed a chaotic shrine to the man who had vanished into the very frequencies they both sought to understand. She adjusted the headphones over her ears, the familiar weight a small comfort as she pressed play on the latest set of Elias's recordings. At first, the sounds were nothing more than the usual static hiss, the electrical storms that had become the city's grim soundtrack ever since the relentless weather had taken hold. But as the minutes stretched on, faint voices, fragile and fragmented, emerged beneath the noise. They were not the voices they had heard before, the desperate pleas from the trapped realm, but something different, subtle shifts in tone, patterns in the interference, as if Elias himself was reaching out from somewhere beyond. Mara's breath caught. She leaned closer to the speakers, straining to catch the nuances hidden within the white noise. The crackled whispers ebbed and flowed like ghostly tendrils, brushing against the edges of her consciousness. A pang of sorrow washed over her. Elias was gone, sacrificed himself to save those voices. Yet these recordings suggested he had not entirely left them behind. She withdrew a notebook from the cluttered desk, flipping to a page filled with Elias's frantic scrawling's waveforms, frequency notations, and cryptic annotations about liminal spaces and consciousness transfer. Her finger traced the lines as her mind pieced together the puzzle he had left behind. Elias had theorized that the storms created overlapping dimensional layers, and that the static was more than noise. It was a veil, a medium for trapped consciousnesses to persist. Mara's eyes flicked to the monitors where audio waveforms danced erratically. She opened specialized software Elias had been developing, designed to filter and amplify signals buried deep within the chaos. As the program ran, a new pattern emerged, a repeating sequence interwoven with the static, subtle enough to have been missed, but unmistakably deliberate. Her pulse quickened. Had Elias embedded a message within his final transmissions? Was this his way of saying he was still there, somewhere between worlds? She played back the filtered audio repeatedly. The sequence resolved itself into faint syllables, fragments of words, then a voice soft, tired, but unmistakably Elias's. Mara, listen, not gone. Still here, between. A tear slipped down her cheek. The studio, once a place of cold technical work, now felt charged with presence, a bridge spanning the chasm of absence. She whispered his name, a fragile hope blossoming amidst the ruins of grief. The next morning, Mara met with Dr. Kalen Sato in a small cafe near the studio. The scientist's pale eyes reflected cautious optimism as Mara shared her findings. Doctor, Sato adjusted his glasses thoughtfully, considering the implications. If what you're hearing is true, he said quietly, it means Elias's consciousness has imprinted onto the liminal frequencies. He's become part of the signal, neither fully here nor entirely gone. Mara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. It's both beautiful and heartbreaking. He gave everything to free those voices, and now, he's one with them. They discussed plans to refine the equipment, to track, and perhaps even communicate with Elias's lingering presence. The city outside was waking, the oppressive storms finally giving way to a fragile calm. The ominous static that once dominated the soundscape was thinning, replaced by subtle hums and the distant echoes of a changed reality. Back in the studio, Mara sat alone once more. The air was thick with anticipation as she placed the headphones carefully over her ears. The static swelled, then receded, revealing a clarity she had never heard before. Mara, Elias's voice whispered through the speakers, faint but unmistakable. Hope remains beyond the storm. Mara smiled through tears, clutching the recorder to her chest. She knew the journey was far from over. Elias's sacrifice had opened a door, but the real work, the connection, the understanding, had only just begun. Outside, the city breathed a new rhythm. The lingering echoes of Elias's voice wove through the streets, a haunting melody of sacrifice, hope, and the unyielding human will to reach beyond the known. And in that fragile harmony, Mara found the strength to carry on. The dawn broke with an unfamiliar softness, the oppressive weight of the electrical storms lifting just enough to reveal a city transformed. Mara Lynn stood at the edge of her apartment balcony, eyes scanning the horizon where the usual jagged silhouettes of lightning had, for the first time in years, faded into a gentle wash of pale light. The air was different, not just in temperature or scent, but in its very texture. Gone was the constant crackle and buzz of static that had defined the city's soundscape, replaced by a subtle, almost musical hum that whispered through the empty streets. She inhaled deeply, the cool, fresh air filling her lungs with a sense of renewal she hadn't dared to hope for. For years, the city had been imprisoned beneath an unending shroud of storms and interference, each thundering pulse a reminder of the unseen battles waged in frequencies beyond human perception. Now, that storm was retreating, leaving behind a silence that was almost sacred in its rarity. Inside her small apartment, the walls were lined with screens and recording devices, remnants of a past era of obsession. Mara's fingers brushed over the worn edges of Elias's notes and recordings, now preserved like fragile relics. Elias Vorn had been the catalyst for this change, the man who dared to listen when everyone else had turned away. His sacrifice had been the final key that unlocked the liminal space, bridging the chasm between worlds and silencing the static that had haunted the city for so long. She turned to the comlink, reaching out to Dr. Kalen Sato, whose lab was nestled deep within the heart of the city's research district. The line crackled briefly before the scientist's calm voice filled the room. "Good morning, Mara. The readings are stable. The storm activity has dropped to levels we haven't recorded since before the first anomalies appeared. It's as if the city is breathing again." Mara nodded, though he couldn't see her. "What about the frequencies? Is the hidden broadcast still active?" "There's a new baseline now," Sato replied, his tone measured but optimistic. "A subtle pulse beneath the surface, a resonance that suggests the liminal space is no longer collapsing, but stabilizing. It's faint but persistent, almost like a heartbeat." Mara allowed herself a small smile. a heartbeat. After all this time, that's the kind of signal we needed. Their conversation was interrupted by a distant sound, the laughter of children playing in a nearby park. Mara's gaze drifted to the window, where small groups of residents cautiously ventured outside, their faces illuminated by the soft morning light. For the first time in memory, the streets felt less like a battleground and more like home. As the day unfolded, Mara wandered through the city, her senses attuned to the subtle shifts around her. The usual harsh glare of neon signs was tempered by the gentle glow of dawn, the relentless hum of machinery replaced by the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional distant bird call. Even the air seemed charged with a new energy, not the destructive fury of storms past, but the fragile promise of renewal. At a small cafe, Mara overheard conversations filled with cautious optimism. Residents spoke of the calm, speculating on what it meant for their future. Some whispered about Elias, recounting tales of the sound engineer who had vanished into the static to save voices trapped beyond their world. His name was no longer spoken with fear, but with reverence. Later, Mara met with Dr. Sato in his laboratory, a sterile space filled with blinking consoles and humming machines. He pointed to a series of graphs displayed on a large monitor, each line tracing the city's electromagnetic activity over time. "See this," he said, tapping the screen. "This is the storm's descent, an unprecedented drop in interference. And here, beneath the noise floor, a new frequency emerges. It's stable, coherent, and unlike anything we've recorded before." Mara leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Could it be the voices? The ones Elias was trying to reach? Sato nodded slowly. "It's possible. Whatever it is, it represents a new phase, a connection, not a barrier, but it's delicate. We can't be sure what this new balance means long term." The scientist's words echoed the uncertainty lingering in Mara's mind. The city was breathing easier, yes, but the scars of the past storms ran deep. The silent authority that had sought to suppress knowledge still lurked in shadows, and the liminal spaces remained a mystery. As twilight descended, Mara climbed to the rooftop of her building, the city stretching beneath her in a tapestry of dimming lights. The air was cool, carrying faint whispers of static, or perhaps memory, that seemed to dance just beyond hearing. She closed her eyes, letting the sounds wash over her, a bittersweet symphony of loss and hope. Elias's voice echoed in her mind, a final transmission that had transcended worlds. He had given everything to open the door, to offer rescue to those trapped beyond the storm. Now, as the city settled into uneasy peace, Mara felt the weight of that sacrifice. But beneath the melancholy, there was a spark, a fragile thread of connection weaving through the quiet night. The city was waking up from its long nightmare, and though the future remained uncertain, the dawn had come. And with it, the promise of new beginnings. The room was thick with a low hum of static, a sound that had become both a comfort and a torment to Mara Lynn. She sat cross-legged on the worn floor of Elias's studio, the walls lined with tangled wires, archaic audio equipment, and stacks of notebooks filled with indecipherable scrawl. The faint glow of the monitor cast pale light across her determined face as she pressed play on the battered tape recorder. Elias's voice emerged from the crackling static, fragile and distant, as if carried across an impossible gulf. "If you're hearing this, then maybe I'm not completely lost. Maybe there's still a chance. Listen closely, the static isn't just noise. It's a veil. Behind it, there are voices, trapped, suffering. They need us." The words wove a thread of bittersweet connection through Mara's chest, tightening and loosening with each breath. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. It was as if Elias spoke directly to her, his presence lingering in the ether, defying the silence his disappearance had enforced. For weeks now, Mara had been haunted by these recordings, fragments of Elias's last days, and his unyielding hope threaded through the static haze. The city outside remained indifferent or worse, complicit in guarding its secrets. The oppressive electrical storm still raged, the sky a perpetual canvas of flickering neon and restless shadows. Yet in the quiet moments, when the world seemed to pause beneath the crackle of interference, Elias's voice was the tether that kept her grounded. She rose and paced, the soft scrape of her boots on the scuffed floor the only sound besides the static chorus. Her mind raced with memories of their shared frustration, the late-night debates, and the city's indifferent gaze. Elias had vanished into the liminal space he sought to understand, leaving behind a void filled with static and unanswered questions. Determined not to let his sacrifice dissolve into oblivion, Mara had begun to speak out. The next morning, she found herself seated at a cluttered cafe table, facing a skeptical panel of city officials and investigative journalists. Her short hair was damp from the rain, her eyes sharp and unyielding as she laid out the evidence Elias had gathered, recordings, data analyses, and personal testimonies. "The storms are not just weather phenomena," she insisted, voice steady despite the tension hanging thickly in the air. "They are the surface expression of a deeper fracture between worlds, between realities." Elias uncovered a hidden frequency, a broadcast from a trapped realm crying out for rescue. The officials exchanged uneasy glances, some shifting uncomfortably, others dismissing her as a zealot. Mara pressed on, refusing to be silenced. "This isn't just about science or technology, it's about human lives. We owe it to Elias, and to those voices, to bring these truths into the light." Outside, the city pulsed with its usual restless energy. Mara stepped into the rain-soaked streets, the neon signs flickering erratically overhead. Drops splattered against her coat, mingling with the static buzz in her ears. She paused beneath a fractured street lamp, the glow casting fractured shadows that danced like ghosts. For a moment, she thought she heard Elias's voice, carried on the wind, a spectral echo that stirred both sorrow and hope. Her footsteps echoed through the alleyways as she made her way home. The weight of solitude pressed against her, but beneath it was a resolve forged in grief and determination. She was no longer just a witness to Elias's mission. She was its torchbearer. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of a community art space, Mara stood before a mural that had been commissioned in Elias's memory. It depicted the storm-racked cityscape, swirling with vibrant streaks of static, shadowed figures reaching out across the painted divide. She traced a finger along the jagged lines, feeling a connection deeper than words could express. "I won't let you be forgotten," she whispered, her breath misting the glass that protected the artwork. "Your voice will carry on in the storm, in the silence, in the static. We'll find a way together." The city outside began to calm as the storm slowly waned, but Mara knew the battle was far from over. The silent authorities still lurked in the shadows, their grip tightening against the tide of truth. Yet, armed with Elias's recordings and her own indomitable spirit, Mara was prepared to face whatever came next. In the fading light, the static hummed softly, a reminder that even in absence, connection endures. And somewhere beyond the veil, Elias's voice lingered, a beacon in the storm, urging her onward. The journey ahead was uncertain, but Mara's resolve was clear. The silence would be broken, the hidden signals revealed, and the voices trapped beyond the static would finally find their rescue. Until then, she would carry their memory like a fragile flame in the night, lighting the path through the storm's quiet aftermath. The conference room was steeped in a haze of low light and anticipation. Rows of folding chairs creaked under the weight of a handful of academics and journalists, their faces etched with curiosity and skepticism. Dr. Kalen Sato stood poised behind the podium, his thin frame almost swallowed by the oversized lab coat that had become his trademark. His pale fingers adjusted the microphone as the projector flickered to life, casting a faint glow over his neatly arranged slides. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sato began, his voice steady despite the gravity of his revelations. After years of investigation into the city's electromagnetic anomalies and the recordings left behind by the late Elias Vorn, we have finally begun to understand the presence of liminal spaces, transitory zones, where the fabric between our reality and others thins and distorts. The crowd leaned in, a murmur rippling through the room. Sato detailed the experimental methods used to detect these zones, correlating storm activity with bursts of unexplained frequencies. He carefully navigated the line between empirical evidence and theoretical implications, knowing full well how fragile the acceptance of such ideas would be. Meanwhile, in a cramped lab cluttered with humming servers and tangled wires, Mara Lin sat beside Sato. Their faces were bathed in the iridescent light emitted from monitors displaying Elias's last transmissions. "He never stopped searching," Mara whispered, her voice barely audible over the chorus of static that filled the room. Sato nodded solemnly, his eyes reflecting the flickering waveforms. "His sacrifice wasn't in vain," Sato murmured. "Now we have a foundation of scientific foothold to explore what was once relegated to myth and paranoia." As the night deepened, the academic community's response was a mixture of excitement and incredulity. Online forums buzzed with heated debates. Some hailed the paper as a breakthrough that could redefine physics and metaphysics alike, while others dismissed it as fanciful speculation. News outlets ran cautious headlines, "New Dimensions. Scientist publishes controversial study," and "Liminal Spaces, Science or Science Fiction." Amid the clamor, Mara found herself on the city's rooftop at dawn, the cold rain slicking her hair to her scalp. The storm clouds had thinned, leaving behind a fragile stillness, pierced by the faint hum of residual static. She clutched Elias's portable recorder, tuning the dial with trembling hands. A soft, almost imperceptible frequency emerged, an echo of the voices Elias had devoted his life to freeing. A fragile hope blossomed within her chest, mingled with the ache of loss and the weight of uncertainty. Somewhere beyond the storms, connections were rekindling, fragile threads weaving new possibilities between worlds. The path ahead was uncertain, but the door had been opened, and the human urge to reach beyond the known burned brighter than ever. As Mara listened, the city around her slowly awoke, bathed in the muted light of a new dawn, one where isolation might give way to connection, and where the echoes of sacrifice resonated as a promise for what could come next. The journey was far from over, but with Sato's findings illuminating the path, a cautious optimism took root amidst the ruins of static and shadow. The question lingered like the fading storm: would humanity have the courage to follow it? The city had changed, though the change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Mara Lin sat cross-legged on the floor of her modest apartment, the hum of numerous devices filling the air with a low, steady pulse. A bank of monitors flickered before her, streams of data scrolling in rapid succession. Dr. Kalen Sato stood behind her, adjusting the settings on an antique radio receiver salvaged from a forgotten corner of the city. The storm that had once raged relentlessly, drowning the city in static and electrical fury, had quieted to a gentle flicker of neon lightning in the distance. The oppressive hum that had been the city's constant companion was now a soft melody, threading itself through the urban noise like a whispered promise. "Look at this," Mara said, her voice breaking the silence as she pointed to a cluster of waveforms on the largest screen. The patterns pulsed with a rhythm that was both alien and familiar, a delicate dance of frequencies weaving through the ether. "It's new." Sato adjusted his glasses, his pale face illuminated by the glow of the monitors. A signal emerging from the static. "I've never seen anything quite like it. The harmonics suggest a stabilized transmission, but there's a complexity, here layers of modulation that imply an intelligence behind it." Mara's fingers danced over the keyboard, isolating fragments of the broadcast. The speakers crackled softly before a voice, distorted but unmistakably human, filtered through the noise. It was faint, fragile like a candle, struggling against the wind, but it carried a message that resonated deep within them. "Thank you," the voice whispered, barely audible, then faded into a shimmering silence. Mara's breath caught, and she glanced at Sato, who nodded slowly, his eyes reflecting the same mixture of disbelief and hope. "It's them," Mara whispered, "the voices. They're reaching out." Outside, the city breathed differently. The usual cacophony of electric interference was replaced by a strange harmony, a delicate undercurrent that twisted through the air like a secret song. Neon lights flickered softly, casting long shadows that no longer felt oppressive, but imbued with a new kind of life. The storms, which had once been relentless and cruel, now seemed to recede into memory. Mara stepped onto her balcony, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She gazed out over the cityscape towering skyscrapers, adorned with holographic ads, streets alive with restless energy, and the distant silhouette of the liminal zone where realities converged. In the quiet, she felt a presence, an echo of Elias's voice carried within the renewed signal. It was as if he lingered still, a guardian watching over the fragile bridge they had forged between worlds. The discovery was more than a scientific breakthrough. It was a testament to resilience, to the relentless human urge to connect across impossible divides. Yet Mara knew the path ahead was uncertain. The silent authority, though weakened, had not vanished. The delicate harmony they had found could yet be shattered by old fears and new threats. But for now, hope blossomed amid the remnants of static noise. The rescued voices had found a way to speak once more, their whispers transforming into a chorus that promised a future where isolation could be broken and connection, no matter how fragile, could endure. Mara turned back inside, her heart pounding with renewed purpose. She and Sato would continue their work, guarding this new dawn. The signal was renewed, and with it, the possibility of a world transformed. As the city settled into an uneasy peace, one thing was clear: the echo between the realms would never be silenced again. And somewhere, deep within the shifting currents of the liminal space, Elias listened on, a faint smile tracing the edges of his consciousness. The signal was no longer just static, it was a beacon, a lifeline, a promise. But would it hold? The question hung in the air, unanswered, as the city beneath the calm sky pulsed quietly, waiting. The city had changed. The incessant electrical storms that once screamed across the sky had dwindled to a rare, distant rumble, and the static that had blanketed the airwaves like a suffocating fog was now a gentle whisper, a fragile breath of something new. From the rooftop where I stood, the horizon stretched wide and electric, but the storm's fury had softened, the neon glow of billboards flickering faintly beneath a sky that was, for the first time in years, almost calm. I pulled my coat tighter against the chill, the wind carrying a scent of ozone and cold rain, a smell so familiar, now it felt like a memory etched into my bones. Below me, the city's streets wound like veins, pulsing with a quiet life that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. I thought of Elias, his tired eyes, the way his fingers had danced over the controls, chasing sounds only he could hear. His sacrifice had carved a silence deeper than any storm, but within it, a promise. Back inside my small apartment, the cluttered desk was strewn with Elias's recordings and notes, a chaotic symphony of waveforms and scribbled annotations that pulsed with his voice and his obsession. I traced the jagged lines with trembling fingers, the static, the hidden signals, the desperate pleas from a world trapped beyond our own. Each crackle and hiss was a thread, a lifeline to something lost and yet to be found. The weight of his absence pressed down on me, but beneath the grief was a flicker of determination. Elias had bridged a chasm no one else dared approach. Now it was my turn to carry the torch, to unravel the threads he had left behind. I played the recordings again and again, letting the fragmented voices seep into the silence, learning their patterns, their rhythms. They were no longer just static. They were echoes of hope. A knock at the door drew me from my reverie. Dr. Kalen Sato stepped inside, his thin frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His pale eyes held that familiar mix of scientific curiosity and moral ambiguity. We had come a long way from our initial distrust, bound now by the shared burden of knowledge and the cost it demanded. "The city's changing," he said softly, removing his coat. "The storms are fewer, the static less oppressive. But the balance is fragile. This quiet, it could break at any moment." I nodded, feeling the truth in his words. Elias's sacrifice opened something. A window, maybe. But it's up to us to keep it from closing. To make sure the voices don't fade back into silence. He sighed, adjusting his glasses. And the authority, they won't let this go easily. Control is their currency. Transparency is a threat. "Then we'll make them see," I replied, a fierce resolve settling in my chest. The city deserves to know. The people deserve to hear the truth beneath the static. Our conversation was interrupted by the soft hum of my equipment powering up. A faint new frequency emerged, delicate and wavering, threading through the quiet air like a tentative heartbeat. I leaned closer, eyes closed, letting the fragile signal wash over me. It was a whisper of connection, a promise that the voices were still reaching out, still fighting to be heard. The quiet between storms was no longer empty. It was alive with possibility, a delicate balance between isolation and connection. The journey had cost us dearly, but in the stillness, I found a kind of peace, a bittersweet hope that the story was far from over. As night deepened, the city below shimmered with neon and shadow, a cyberpunk tapestry woven from light and silence. And in that darkness, I felt Elias's presence, a quiet echo beyond the storm, guiding me toward a dawn yet to come. The silence was no longer a void. It was a signal, a call to listen, to remember, and to reach beyond the known into the vast, uncharted static of possibility. But even as hope flickered, a question lingered in the back of my mind, sharp and insistent. How far was I willing to go to keep the connection alive? And what would it cost me to answer the quiet between? The city waited, breath held, caught in the fragile balance of a new dawn. And so did I. The storm had finally reached its crescendo, a violent symphony of crackling electricity and howling wind that seemed to tear the very fabric of the city apart. Inside the liminal nexus, the air pulsed with an almost tangible energy. Elias Vorn stood at the heart of it, surrounded by the flickering shadows and whispers that had become his constant companions. His hands trembled as he adjusted the final settings on the device, a complex amalgamation of salvage tech and experimental modifications, crafted to stabilize the fragile boundary between worlds. "This is it," he murmured to himself, voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. The static that had once haunted his every waking moment now seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat, a living presence that both comforted and unnerved him. With a final flick of a switch, the device hummed to life, sending waves of coherent energy rippling outward into the darkness. From the depths of the static, voices emerged clearer, stronger, no longer mere fragments, but a chorus of souls reaching across the divide. "We hear you," Elias whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "You're not alone anymore." His transmission crackled through the storm, a message of hope and resolve sent into the void. To those trapped beyond the veil, his voice echoed, "I promise rescue. Though I may vanish from your world, my connection remains. Hold on." As the last words left his lips, the device surged, the boundaries between realities shimmering and folding like paper. A blinding light enveloped Elias, pulling him away from the city he loved, from Mara and Dr. Sato and the life he once knew. The storm outside began to wane, the oppressive static receding like a tide. Hours later, Mara stood beneath the clearing sky, the aftermath of the tempest painting the city in muted hues. Clutching Elias' final recording, she let the haunting melody of his voice wash over her, a bittersweet balm for the aching void. "He's gone," she whispered, "but not lost." In a dimly lit lab, Dr. Kalen Sato analyzed the residual signals emanating from the liminal space. The patterns defied conventional science, complex and alive, hinting at Elias' consciousness persisting beyond known dimensions. "This is only the beginning," he mused, eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Outside, the city breathed under an unusually calm sky. The familiar electrical storms had faded, replaced by a delicate hum, a subtle, persistent static that carried faint, hopeful voices. It was a reminder that connection, no matter how fragile, endured. Elias' sacrifice had opened a door, a fragile bridge between worlds that promised redemption and understanding. Yet beneath the quiet lay questions unanswered, mysteries lingering like shadows at the edge of perception. As the city settled into uneasy peace, the echoes beyond the storm whispered of futures yet to be written. The end was not an end at all, but a beginning, a testament to the relentless human urge to reach beyond the known, to connect, to hope. And in that quiet space between worlds, Elias' voice lived on, a beacon in the static, calling out across the void. The storm had passed, but its echoes would resonate forever.